Hello and welcome. I know many of you use these videos to help you fall asleep. So before we begin, be sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also comment where you're from and at what time you're watching. Take a moment to get comfortable, relax, and let yourself unwind. Name of the story: The Forgotten Highway. It was the kind of trip that should have been smooth and easy. Paul had been on the road for hours, driving down a highway he knew well, headed to visit an old friend he hadn't seen in years. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the empty road, and the steady hum of the engine was like a lullaby. But as the minutes passed, something felt off. He had been following the GPS, but after a long stretch of highway, the voice on the device stopped giving directions, leaving him alone with his thoughts and the eerie silence that filled the car. He checked his phone. No signal. Not that surprising. He was deep in rural territory, far from the nearest town. But that didn't explain why, when he checked the map, there was a road that appeared out of nowhere. It was a narrow, almost invisible strip winding through dense trees, a shortcut that promised to shave off an hour or more from his trip. He debated for only a moment. Maybe it'll save me some time, Paul muttered to himself. He turned the wheel, the tires crunching over the gravel as he veered onto the forgotten road. The moment he left the main highway, the atmosphere shifted. The air seemed heavier, thicker. The trees on either side of the road loomed taller, their trunks twisted in unnatural ways. Their leaves, a dull, almost sickly shade of green, hung low, blocking out much of the sunlight. Paul squinted against the growing darkness, trying to adjust his eyes. As he drove deeper into the woods, he noticed something unsettling. The road wasn't on any map. He flipped through his phone's GPS, but there was no signal. It was as if this road simply didn't exist. "Great," Paul muttered, tapping the screen again. "Where the hell am I?" He looked around, but the landscape seemed to remain unchanged. The trees were now so close to the road that the branches scraped against the sides of the car. And the further he went, the more it felt as if the road was narrowing, forcing him deeper into the forest. A low, almost imperceptible hum filled the air, like the buzzing of insects, but too constant and mechanical to be natural. It wasn't until he rounded a bend in the road that he saw it, something up ahead. At first, it was a flicker, like a shadow darting between the trees. He slowed down, squinting through the windshield. Then he saw it clearly, a figure standing motionless by the side of the road. It was a man, tall and thin, dressed in ragged clothes, his back to Paul. The figure didn't move. Not a single twitch. "Who the hell is that?" Paul whispered, his heart skipping a beat. He hesitated, but something in his gut told him not to stop. His foot stayed on the gas, and he drove past, but just as he did, the man turned his head, staring directly at the car. His face was pale, and his eyes, too wide, too empty, sent a chill down Paul's spine. Without thinking, Paul slammed his foot on the gas, speeding away from the figure, his heart pounding in his chest. Minutes passed, or maybe hours. Time seemed to stretch and bend as he continued along the road. The trees were more twisted now, their branches almost clawing at the air. The sky above was darkening quickly, and the soft hum of the engine was the only sound, save for the occasional crackle of the radio. The car's headlights flickered, then dimmed, and Paul cursed under his breath. He tapped the dashboard, trying to get them to work again, but nothing happened. He looked out the window and saw the same man again. Only this time, the figure was standing in the middle of the road. "What the hell?" Paul whispered, his eyes fixed on the figure as he slowly approached. The man didn't move, didn't flinch. He just stared, his eyes too wide, too unblinking. Paul slammed on the brakes, coming to a stop just a few feet from the man. The car's engine sputtered, then died completely. The silence was deafening. Paul reached for the keys, trying to start the engine again, but nothing happened. He sat there, staring at the figure, unable to look away. The man remained still, unblinking, and after what felt like an eternity, He spoke in a voice that seemed too soft, too far away. "Turn back," the man whispered. Paul's breath caught in his throat. "What?" The man took a step forward, his face slowly emerging from the shadows. His features were sharp, gaunt, and unnatural, like something out of a nightmare. His skin was pale and stretched tight over his bones, and his eyes, those dark, hollow eyes, never once looked away from Paul. "Turn back," the man repeated, his voice a rasping whisper. Paul didn't know why, but he felt compelled to answer. I can't. I need to keep going." The man tilted his head, and a slow, eerie grin spread across his face. "Then you'll never leave." Paul's breath quickened. He turned the key again, desperately trying to start the engine. But the car was dead, unresponsive, like it had been abandoned by some unseen force. He looked up, but the figure was gone. The road was empty, the trees silent once more. He tried the keys again, and this time, the engine roared to life. He didn't waste a second. With trembling hands, he threw the car into reverse and sped backward, the tires screeching as they tore through the gravel. But no matter how fast he drove, the road seemed to stretch on forever. It felt like the trees were closing in on him, their gnarled branches reaching out like twisted fingers, blocking his way. The road curved and twisted in ways it hadn't before, the turns sharper and more treacherous. And in the distance, Paul could swear he saw lights flickering in the trees, distant, fading like the glow of headlights. Was he being followed? He didn't dare look in the rearview mirror. Instead, he focused on the road ahead. But as he drove faster, the landscape around him began to change again. The trees thinned out, replaced by empty fields, and in the distance, there was something strange. Something he couldn't quite make out. It was a shape, large, looming, and it seemed to pulse with an unnatural light. Something about it felt wrong, as though it didn't belong, as though it was waiting for him. The more he stared, the closer it seemed to come. The car's headlights flickered again, and he realized they were no longer illuminating the road. They were illuminating something else, something far darker. And that was when he saw it. An old, rotting sign at the side of the road, barely visible through the fog that had begun to settle in. The words, barely legible, read, "Abandon all hope, ye who enter here." A chill ran down his spine. He had seen the phrase before, in stories, in books. But this was no story. This was real. His heart began to race. The car was slowing down, the engine sputtering again. Panic clawed at him as he glanced frantically at the gas gauge. It was still full. This wasn't normal. The road wasn't normal. And he was no longer alone. The road had become a twisted, endless thing, pulling him deeper into something Paul couldn't quite name. The fog, thick and suffocating, wrapped itself around the car like a cold blanket, blurring the world outside. His grip on the steering wheel tightened, and he could feel his pulse pounding in his temples. The sign he had passed haunted him. "Abandon all hope, ye who enter here." He had heard of this kind of thing before, legends, tales of places where the rules of the world no longer applied, where time itself twisted and reality became a mockery. But this couldn't be one of those places, could it? Not for him. Not today. His fingers trembled as he fumbled with the radio, desperate for anything that might feel normal. Static. Endless, mind-numbing static. And then he heard it. A faint voice, crackling through the radio's hiss. So faint at first he thought he imagined it. "Help!" Paul's heart skipped. He turned the dial, trying to find the source of the voice, but it only grew louder. The voice was distorted, broken, like it was coming from far away. Yet it sounded so close. "Help me, please." His hands were shaking now. Was it real? Was someone out there? Paul snapped the radio off and looked around. The trees, tall and grotesque, pressed in closer, their branches like skeletal hands reaching for the car. He could see nothing ahead but the fog. No sign of life. No sign of anything. The car suddenly jolted, as if something had hit it. Paul slammed on the brakes, nearly sending himself through the windshield. His eyes darted to the rearview mirror. Nothing. The road behind him was empty. No lights, no movement. He looked ahead, his breath shallow, but the road seemed to stretch on endlessly, impossibly long. The shape, the looming figure from earlier, was gone now. But the light, faint but growing stronger, still shimmered in the distance, pulling him forward. Against his better judgment, he drove on. The road twisted again, this time sharply to the right. His tires screeched as he turned the wheel, and as he did, the landscape morphed yet again. The trees began to thin, and the once familiar woods were replaced by barren land. The air felt heavier now, colder, and Paul could see his breath clouding in front of him, even though the car's heater was on. Then he saw it, a shadow in the distance. At first, he thought it was just another tree, but it wasn't. It was too large, too unnatural. It moved, slowly, deliberately. Paul's heart pounded. He slowed the car, then stopped, his breath caught in his throat. The shadow was growing larger, and as it approached, he realized it was a figure. A woman. Her silhouette was tall, her hair wild and long, trailing behind her like some kind of dark halo. "Who is that?" Paul whispered to himself, his throat dry. The woman came closer, walking across the empty field with slow, measured steps. Her face remained hidden in the shadow of her hair, but there was something unnatural about the way she moved. Her feet didn't touch the ground, hovering inches above the earth, as though gravity itself had no hold on her. Paul tried to speak, but his mouth felt dry, his tongue heavy. He wanted to scream, to ask her where he was, how to get out, but his voice failed him. The woman stopped in front of the car, her feet just inches from the hood. Her head tilted slightly to the side, and for the first time, Paul saw her face. Her eyes were wide, too dark. There were no whites, just a vast, empty blackness that seemed to swallow the light. Her mouth twisted into a grin, her lips stretching impossibly thin. She spoke, her voice cold and distant. "You shouldn't have come." The words were sharp, like ice slicing through the air, but they seemed to echo, bouncing off the trees and the very earth beneath them. Paul's body went stiff. He couldn't move, couldn't speak. "Turn around," she whispered, her voice no longer distant but right next to his ear, as if she was inside the car with him. "Turn around and go back." Paul felt a chill crawl down his spine. He couldn't turn around. He couldn't go back. This place, this road, was a trap, a never-ending loop pulling him further and further into whatever nightmare it had created. "Please," he choked, his voice hoarse. "I just want to get out. I just need to leave." But the woman's smile only widened, and her black eyes gleamed with something dark, something that made his stomach turn. She raised a finger to her lips, her expression now cold, void of any empathy. "Leave?" she whispered, and suddenly, her face was so close to his that he could feel her breath, cold as the grave. "There is no leaving. Not now." Before Paul could react, the woman stepped back, vanishing into the mist, like she had never been there. The car's engine sputtered again, and Paul's stomach dropped. The landscape had changed yet again. The fog was thicker now, pressing against the car like a living thing, and the road was no longer just a road. It was an endless stretch of black pavement, crumbling and cracked, with no signs of civilization in sight. There were no lights, no houses, no people, just endless emptiness. He looked at the rearview mirror again, but there was nothing. No one behind him. He tried to focus on the road ahead, but the farther he drove, the more warped it seemed to become. The road twisted into impossible shapes, looping back on itself in ways that made no sense. He had been down this stretch before, hadn't he? Yet the road was completely different now. Paul was beginning to panic. The sense of isolation was suffocating, like the world had folded in on itself, leaving him trapped in this strange, hollow place. There was no escape. Then, as if answering his unspoken thoughts, the car's headlights illuminated something in the distance. It was another figure, but this time there was no mistaking it. A car, a broken-down vehicle, sitting alone in the middle of the road. The hood was raised, and the dim glow of the headlights reflected off the twisted metal, giving it an almost eerie, ghostly appearance. Paul's heart skipped a beat. Was this another trick? Was this part of the road's curse? He slowed down, the sound of his tires on the cracked pavement echoing in the still air. He leaned forward, squinting at the broken car ahead, and then he saw the figure beside it. A man. Paul's foot hovered over the brake pedal. He couldn't tell if the man was real or another figment of this twisted nightmare, but his instincts screamed at him to stop. Maybe this person knew something about the road, about the strange place he had driven into. Maybe he could help. The man stood motionless beside the car, his body hunched over as if he were waiting for something or someone. His clothes were ragged, torn, as if he had been out here for a very long time. Paul couldn't make out much of his face in the dim light, but his posture seemed wrong. The figure didn't seem to move, didn't react to the car's headlights, or even the sound of the engine. Taking a deep breath, Paul forced his hands to unclench from the steering wheel. He needed answers. He couldn't keep driving aimlessly, not like this. He pulled the car to a stop a few feet from the man, the tires crunching on the gravel as he parked. The fog had thickened again, swirling around the vehicle like a living, breathing thing, and the silence pressed in on him from all sides. He rolled down the window slowly, the cool air rushing inside, smelling of damp earth and something else, something metallic. "Hey!" Paul called out, his voice trembling. "Are you okay? Do you need help?" The man didn't respond. For a long, agonizing moment, Paul waited, staring at the figure. He could feel his heart thumping in his chest, but still the man didn't move. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the figure slowly lifted his head. Paul felt a wave of dread wash over him. The man's face was pale, gaunt, and his eyes, those empty, hollow eyes, were wide open, as though they could see into Paul's very soul. He said nothing. His gaze was fixed on Paul with a strange, unsettling intensity. "Hey, are you?" Paul started to ask again, but before he could finish, the man's lips parted in a slow, deliberate smile. It wasn't a friendly smile, but one that seemed to stretch too wide, exposing far too many teeth. His mouth opened unnaturally wide, and for a split second, Paul thought he saw something moving behind the man's lips, something wriggling. The man stepped forward, and Paul's breath caught in his throat. He wanted to scream, to shout, to drive away, but his body refused to obey. The man continued to smile, the eerie grin growing even wider as he took another step closer. "No one ever leaves," the man whispered, his voice cold and empty. "Not once you're on the forgotten highway." Paul's skin crawled at the words. The man's voice was too hollow, too distant, like it didn't belong in this world. He was saying the same thing the woman had said, the words ringing in Paul's ears like a warning. "Please," Paul stammered, his throat tight. "I don't want to be here. I just need to leave." The man tilted his head, his smile never faltering, and for the first time, Paul noticed the strange mark on his neck, a dark, twisted symbol that looked almost like a scar, a burn of some kind. It glowed faintly, pulsing with a dim, sickly light. "No one ever leaves," the man repeated, his voice growing softer. "The road takes them, takes us all." Paul tried to back away, his hands shaking as he reached for the gear shift. But the man's eyes followed every movement. The pressure in the air grew heavier, the silence more suffocating. Without warning, the man reached out a hand, placing it gently against the car's window, his fingers scraping across the glass. Paul recoiled, but the hand stayed there, as though pressing against an invisible force field, and the man's eyes never left his. "Turn around," the man urged. "Turn back. You still can." But the road ahead, no matter how far it stretched, seemed to promise only more of this madness, more of these strange, haunting figures. He couldn't turn back. Not anymore. Paul's breath quickened as the man's grin began to fade, replaced by something darker, more dangerous. The air itself seemed to pulse with malevolent energy, as though the land around him were alive, feeding on his fear. With a final glance at the man, whose body was now unnaturally still like a statue, Paul slammed the car into gear, spinning the wheel and tearing away from the broken vehicle and its strange occupant. The engine roared to life, the tires screeching as they spun out, and the man was quickly swallowed by the thick fog behind him. But no matter how fast he drove, the road kept changing. The landscape ahead shifted again, the empty fields replaced by a thick forest, its trees even darker now, their branches stretching like fingers in every direction. The fog clung to the ground, swirling and shifting as if it were alive, and Paul could barely see a few feet ahead of him. He felt the weight of the night pressing in on him from all sides. The road was narrow now, barely wide enough for the car to pass through. And yet, it kept going, winding and twisting, impossibly longer than it should have been. He glanced at the rearview mirror again, half expecting to see the strange man, or worse, someone else, following behind him. But there was nothing. No other car. No figures in the mist. Just the endless black road, and the fog creeping in from every side. A sudden movement caught his eye. He jerked the wheel to the side, narrowly avoiding a large branch that hung low over the road. It scraped the side of the car with a deafening screech, but he didn't stop. He couldn't afford to stop. Not when he was this close to. The headlights flickered again. Paul cursed, his fingers gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. The car's engine sputtered and groaned, and then, as if to mock him, it died again. He slammed his fist against the dashboard, but the car refused to start. No, no, Paul muttered, trying the keys again. The engine turned over, but it didn't catch. It just sputtered and died. Panic set in. He looked out through the windshield, his chest tightening. The fog was thicker now, too thick to see through, and in the distance, just beyond the reach of his headlights, there was a shape. A shadow, tall, dark, and it was moving toward him. The shadow loomed closer, growing larger with every passing second. Paul's heart raced in his chest, each beat like a drum calling him toward the inevitable. His hands shook violently as he turned the key again, but the engine sputtered out once more. The fog felt like it was alive now, creeping in through the cracks of the car, wrapping around him, suffocating him. He could barely breathe, could barely think. The shape in front of him wasn't just a shadow anymore. It was a figure, tall, gaunt, its form stretching unnaturally long as it approached. The thing was wearing tattered clothes, its movements jerky and unnatural, as if it didn't quite belong to the world Paul knew. It was dragging something behind it, something that scraped against the road with an awful dragging sound. For a split second, Paul thought it was a person, but then he saw it more clearly. Its face was obscured by a mass of black, matted hair, and its limbs, too long, too thin, twisted in ways that no human body could. The thing's hands were claw-like, fingers crooked and bent, and as it drew closer, Paul saw the glint of something metallic in one of its hands, something sharp. His breath caught in his throat. The thing was close enough now for Paul to see that its eyes were wide open, but they weren't eyes at all. There were just hollow, black pits where eyes should have been, an endless darkness that seemed to suck in the light from the fog around it. The scraping sound grew louder as the thing dragged what it was carrying closer. It was an old, rusted chain, wrapped around a large metal object. As it reached the front of the car, the figure stopped and tilted its head. The sound of it breathing, slow, labored, raspy, echoed in Paul's mind. No. Paul's hand fumbled for the door handle, his mind screaming at him to run, to get out of the car, but his body refused to move. The figure's head tilted further, and then it took a step forward, the chain rattling with each movement. It was only a few feet away from the car now, its presence overwhelming, suffocating. Paul had no choice. He had to run. With trembling hands, he yanked the door open and leaped out of the car. The air hit him like a slap in the face, the cold cutting through him, but he didn't stop. He ran, faster than he had ever run in his life, down the road, away from the creature, away from the car. His breath was ragged, the sound of his feet pounding against the pavement drowning out everything else. The fog seemed to chase him, pressing in from every side. His mind screamed at him to keep going, to keep running, but a part of him knew it was pointless. No matter how fast he ran, the road wouldn't end. It couldn't end. Behind him, he could hear it, the sound of something dragging, something heavy scraping against the ground, moving closer and closer. The figure. The thing. Suddenly, Paul stumbled. His feet caught on something, and he fell to the ground, the cold pavement scraping against his palms. His body screamed in protest, but he couldn't stop. He had to keep going. He pushed himself up, but his legs felt like lead. Every breath felt like it was being stolen from him by the thick, suffocating fog that surrounded him. And then, just as quickly as it had started, the scraping sound stopped. Dead silence. Paul froze, his heart pounding in his chest. He dared not look back, knowing that if he did, it would be the last thing he ever did. The fog thickened even more, the world around him dissolving into a hazy white blur. It felt like the very air was swallowing him whole. A low, guttural laugh echoed through the mist. It wasn't human. It was the thing, the creature from the road. It was toying with him. It was waiting. Paul's skin crawled, his fingers trembling as he stood in place, trying to calm his racing thoughts. There was nowhere to go. The road didn't end. The fog didn't lift. It was all wrong. "Help me," a voice whispered through the mist. Paul's blood ran cold. The voice was faint, but he knew it. He had heard it before. It was the voice from the radio. His eyes darted frantically around, searching for the source of the voice, but there was nothing. No one. And then he heard it again, closer this time. "Help me." It was a woman's voice, and it was pleading. Paul's legs were like jelly as he turned around, half expecting to see the thing looming behind him. But there was nothing, just the fog. "Help me, please." The voice was louder now, as though it was right next to him. His heart raced again, and for the briefest moment, he thought maybe, just maybe, someone else was out there. Someone alive. The air grew colder. "Help me." The whisper sounded so desperate, so real. Paul's hands clenched into fists as he fought against the overwhelming urge to turn and run in the opposite direction. But what if this was a trap? What if the creature had lured him into this? He didn't know what to do. But then, a figure emerged from the fog. A silhouette. A person. A woman. Paul's breath caught in his throat as he saw her standing there, just ahead, her face obscured by the mist. She was looking down at the ground, her body shaking slightly, as if she were cold. Are you okay?" Paul called out, his voice cracking in the oppressive silence. The woman didn't respond. Instead, she slowly raised her head, revealing her face. Her eyes were wide and black, just like the creature's. Paul's stomach dropped. The woman's lips parted in an eerie smile. "Help me," she whispered again. And then she stepped toward him, her feet never touching the ground, as if she were floating. "No," Paul whispered, his voice trembling. "Please." "No." But it was too late. The fog seemed to close in around him. He could no longer see the road, the trees, or anything else. He couldn't move. His body was frozen. His mind was screaming at him to run, but he was paralyzed. The woman was getting closer. 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 And then, she was standing right in front of him, her face twisted into that same wide grin, her hollow eyes staring into his soul. And with one last whisper, she said, "There is no way out." The air felt thick, as if it were pressing down on Paul's chest, making it harder and harder to breathe. His heart thundered in his ears, and the oppressive silence around him felt like it was suffocating him. The woman, no, the thing, was so close now he could feel the cold radiating off her, the unnatural chill seeping into his bones. Her smile twisted even further, spreading wide across her face in a grotesque way. It wasn't just a smile anymore. It was an awful, predatory grin, one that didn't belong on a human face. Her eyes were so black, so empty, like two endless voids staring right through him. There was no warmth in them, no soul. "There is no way out," she whispered again, her voice soft and sickly sweet, as if she were savoring every word. Paul's throat closed up, panic rising like a tidal wave, threatening to swallow him whole. He couldn't move. He couldn't speak. The fog pressed in, thick and suffocating, curling around his legs, twisting and writhing like something alive. He could barely see her now, just that smile, that horrible, endless grin. "Turn back," she said, the voice chilling his very soul. "You've gone too far. The road is endless, and it will take you forever." The words repeated in his head, over and over, like a twisted mantra. Forever. Paul finally managed to gasp for air, his chest burning with every shallow breath he took. He fought against the paralysis, against the fear that had rooted him to the spot. There had to be a way out. There had to be something he could do. His hands trembled as he lifted them, as if moving them took all the strength he had left. His fingers found the door handle of the car, cold and slick under his grip. He couldn't stand here any longer. He couldn't let her, whatever she was, get any closer. He yanked the door open, stumbling backward, and ran again, faster this time, his legs burning with the effort. But with every step he took, the fog grew thicker. The road seemed to stretch on forever, an endless ribbon of black, and the trees that lined it were twisted, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers, their gnarled roots rising up from the ground as if trying to grab hold of him. The sound of footsteps followed behind him, slow at first, then growing louder, faster, closer. Paul's heart pounded harder in his chest, his feet stumbling over the uneven road, but still the figure was there. He dared not look behind him. He could feel her presence, feel her closing in like a predator stalking its prey. "Help me," the voice whispered again. It was no longer just a whisper. Now it was a chorus, coming from everywhere around him. It was the voice of the woman, the voice of the man, the voices of others all around him, calling out in pain and fear. All of them trapped here, lost in this God-forsaken place, just like he was. Suddenly, the ground beneath Paul's feet gave way, and he tumbled forward, his body crashing onto the cold, hard ground. He gasped, his breath coming in ragged sobs, as he tried to push himself back up. But the fog had changed. It wasn't just fog anymore. It had morphed into something else, something more sinister, more alive. It was thicker, darker, and it moved like a mass of writhing tendrils, curling around him, choking the life from him. He fought against it, pushing himself to his feet, but the fog was too strong. It wrapped around his arms, his legs, pulling him back down. He screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the mist, absorbed into the choking silence. His body thrashed against the cold grip of the fog, but it wouldn't let go. The whispers grew louder, closer. They were no longer distant voices. They were right in his ear. "Help me! Help me!" Paul's mind spun, his thoughts disjointed, broken. He tried to push himself forward, but it was like running through molasses. Every step felt heavier than the last. The voices came from all directions now, overlapping, blending into a cacophony of anguish and despair. Then, just as quickly as it had started, the fog released him. Paul gasped for air, his body shaking uncontrollably as he pushed himself up from the ground, his legs weak beneath him. He was on his knees now, gasping for breath. His vision blurred, the edges of the road spinning, the trees bending and twisting like they were alive. He didn't know which way to go. All he could do was stumble forward, the world around him warping, distorting. And then, as he took a few shaky steps, he saw something. A shape, a structure in the distance. It was barely visible through the thick fog, but it was there, a large, dark shape. A building, a house. It seemed to rise from the earth like it had always been there, just waiting for him. Without thinking, he stumbled toward it, his feet moving of their own accord, the need for shelter overwhelming his fear. The air grew colder as he neared it, the fog parting to reveal the house in all its eerie detail. The house was old, So old, its wood was warped and weathered, with peeling paint and windows so covered in grime they looked like empty eye sockets. The door was slightly ajar, as if inviting him in. Paul's instincts screamed at him to turn around, to run, but his legs wouldn't obey. He couldn't escape this place. Not now. He reached for the door, his hand trembling, and pushed it open with a slow creak. Inside, the air was thick with dust. The floorboards groaned under his weight as he stepped inside, the darkness swallowing him whole. It was completely silent here, no whispers, no voices. Just the creaking of the house, as if it were alive, waiting. The only light came from the faint glow of the fog outside, seeping through the cracks in the walls. The house seemed endless, each hallway stretching far too long, each room full of shadows that seemed to move just out of the corner of his vision. But there was something in the air, a feeling, a presence, a force that made his skin crawl. He had to find a way out. He couldn't stay here. Not now. But as he moved deeper into the house, the door slammed shut behind him, and the whispers began again. The door slamming shut behind him felt like a finality, a heavy weight settling over Paul's shoulders. His breath hitched in his chest, panic rising once more as he turned to face it. But the door was already sealed tight. It was as though the house itself had locked him in. The walls seemed to press in on him, the silence broken only by the occasional creaking of the floorboards beneath his feet. Paul's eyes scanned the room, dim and shadowed, with only the faintest light trickling through the cracks in the walls. The air was stale, thick with dust, and it felt as if the very house were holding its breath, waiting for something. Paul's heart beat erratically in his chest. His mind was racing, trying to piece together some kind of plan, but it was hard to think. Every step he took felt heavier than the last, as if the house itself was draining his energy, holding him back from moving freely. Every instinct screamed for him to escape, but where? The fog had consumed the world outside, and this house seemed to stretch endlessly. There was no way to know which way led to freedom. He turned, half expecting to see something behind him, but there was nothing, just the shadows, creeping and twisting in the corners of the room. He glanced toward the hallway, his gaze drawn to the dark, narrow corridor that stretched out before him. The whispers were louder now, coming from all directions, but none were clear enough to understand. They were just a maddening, indistinct murmur, like a crowd of voices trying to break through. And then a sound. It was soft at first, almost imperceptible, like a light tapping or scratching. It came from somewhere deeper within the house. Paul froze, listening, trying to pinpoint the source. The noise stopped for a moment, but then it came again, louder this time, scratching, scraping, as if something, or someone was moving just out of sight. "Hello!" Paul called, his voice trembling. It sounded weak even to his own ears. He knew deep down that the house wasn't just abandoned. It was alive in some way, watching him, waiting for him to make a mistake. The scratching sound came again, louder and more frantic, now accompanied by a soft, wet slithering noise. Paul's stomach turned. His hands clenched into fists, his mind racing. What was making that sound? He took a step forward, his legs shaking with each movement. The house felt colder, as if the walls themselves were exhaling a chilling breath, and he could feel the temperature dropping. He didn't know what lay ahead, but he had no choice but to move. The hallway stretched ahead, dark and narrow. Every step he took seemed to echo in the silence, the sound of his footfalls growing louder, more unnatural in the stillness. As he walked further into the house, the slithering sound grew louder too, faster, closer. His instincts screamed for him to turn back, but his legs wouldn't obey. He had to see what was ahead. At the end of the hallway, there was a door. It was ajar, a sliver of darkness visible beyond it. The scratching and slithering were louder now, coming from beyond the door. With a deep, steadying breath, Paul reached for the handle and pushed it open. What he saw beyond the door made his blood run cold. It was a room, large and decayed. The walls were covered in dark stains, some of them streaked with what looked like dried blood. The floor was cracked and uneven, the remnants of old furniture scattered haphazardly across the room. But it wasn't the state of the room that horrified him. It was what was in the center. A figure. It was hunched over, its back bent at an impossible angle, arms too long, dragging along the ground. The scraping sound had come from its movements. It was a thing, no longer human, not really. It was a grotesque mockery of a person with twisted limbs, its skin pale and stretched tight against its bones. Its face was barely recognizable, its features distorted, but there were eyes, empty, hollow, black eyes, staring at Paul with an intensity that sent a cold shiver down his spine. It was as if the thing knew him, knew everything about him. It stopped moving when it saw him, the room falling into a deafening silence. Paul's breath caught in his throat. He wanted to scream, to run, but his feet wouldn't move. The thing's head tilted slightly, its eyes never leaving his. Then, slowly, its lips parted, and it whispered in a voice that sounded like the wind itself, cold and hollow. "You shouldn't have come." The voice echoed through the room, reverberating off the walls, filling the space with a sense of deep dread. Paul's skin crawled, and he felt a sharp, bone-deep chill. He wanted to say something, but his throat felt tight, suffocated by fear. It wasn't alone. From the corners of the room, from the shadows, more figures began to emerge. Like the first, they were hunched and twisted, their forms just barely human, their eyes wide and black, gazing at him with unsettling stillness. They moved slowly, dragging their limbs behind them, their movements jerky and unnatural, like marionettes controlled by invisible strings. Paul's chest tightened as the room seemed to close in on him. The walls felt like they were bending inward, the figures surrounding him, their hollow eyes following his every movement. He couldn't breathe. His heart was pounding so loudly in his ears that it drowned out the scraping and slithering sounds. He had to get out. He didn't know how, didn't know where, but his survival instinct was kicking in. With a surge of adrenaline, he turned and bolted for the door. His feet pounded against the floor, his breath coming in sharp, desperate gasps. He could feel the figures behind him now, moving faster, closing in on him like a pack of wolves. He reached the hallway, his legs screaming in pain as he pushed himself forward, but just as he thought he was safe, the ground beneath him shifted. The floor gave way, and he tumbled forward, landing hard on the cold, splintered wood below. The darkness around him felt alive, pressing against him, suffocating him. And then the whispers returned, louder, more insistent. 1,000 voices, all calling his name. They were everywhere now. The room, the house, the road. There was no escape. And then the floor beneath him shifted again, and Paul felt himself sinking deeper into the earth, the darkness consuming him whole. The world around Paul seemed to dissolve, the darkness swallowing him whole. He tried to scream, but the sound was lost in the suffocating blackness that wrapped around him like a cold, endless void. His body felt weightless, as though the ground had disappeared completely beneath him. There was no up, no down, just the crushing weight of the dark, pressing against him from all sides. He gasped for breath, but the air was thick, heavy, like trying to breathe through wet cloth. His chest felt tight, each breath more difficult than the last. His body trembled from the cold, from the fear, but more than that, there was a growing sense of hopelessness, of something ancient and predatory closing in on him. The whispers were louder now, a cacophony of voices, their words indistinct, but their meaning clear. He was not alone. Paul's mind raced. Where was he? What was happening to him? He reached out with his hands, trying to find something solid, something to anchor himself to, but there was nothing, only more darkness. And then a flicker. A faint light appeared in the distance, just a glimmer at first, but growing brighter with every passing moment. A pale, sickly light, like the flickering of a dying candle. It didn't look natural. It wasn't comforting. It felt wrong, but it was the only thing in this endless dark that could possibly lead him out. With every ounce of strength he had left, he started moving toward it, his legs shaking with exhaustion, his heart still racing, but he couldn't stop. As he moved, the whispers followed, growing louder, clearer, as if they were drawing closer, right behind him. The air grew colder still, the light dimmer with every step. But Paul pressed on, his mind fixed on that pale glow, the only hope in this suffocating darkness. And then as he drew closer, he saw it, the door. It was a massive, ancient door, its wood dark and weathered by time, its surface covered in strange, twisting symbols that seemed to shift in the dim light. The whispers were louder now, all around him, and Paul could hear them clearly. "Go no further. You shouldn't be here. It's too late to turn back now." Paul's heart pounded in his chest as his hand reached out toward the door. He had no choice. He had to find a way out. Whatever lay beyond this door, it had to be better than this suffocating, endless darkness. With a deep breath, he pushed the door open. It creaked loudly, the sound echoing through the blackness, and for a moment, he thought he saw the faintest hint of movement from within. His pulse quickened. As the door swung wide, the light flooded the room, revealing what lay beyond. It wasn't a room, not really. It was a vast, cavernous space, far larger than any room he had seen before, and yet it felt familiar, like a place he had been before, or perhaps a place he was always meant to return to. The floor was stone, cold and uneven and strange. Twisted roots spread out from the walls like veins, pulsating with a faint, unnatural glow. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and rot, and there was a faint, nauseating smell of decay. At the far end of the cavern, there was another figure. This one was different, though. It wasn't twisted like the others. It wasn't hunched or malformed. Instead, it stood tall, cloaked in darkness, its face obscured by a hood. But Paul could feel its eyes on him, could feel its presence pressing down on him like a weight on his chest. The whispers grew louder, and he could hear the voice of the figure clearly, cutting through the noise. "You should not have come here, traveler." The voice was calm, deep, and ancient, yet there was a terrible power behind it, something that made every muscle in Paul's body tense. It felt wrong to be in the presence of this thing, like the very air was charged with something dangerous. "What is this place?" Paul croaked, his voice shaky. He had to know. He needed to understand what was happening. The figure did not move, but Paul could feel its gaze on him, and the air grew colder still. It spoke again, its voice echoing in the cavernous space. "This is the place of lost things," it said, its tone cold and final. "The place where roads that should never have been traveled lead to. The forgotten highway is a path that does not belong in the world of men. And now you have crossed it." Paul's mind spun. The forgotten highway. This was it. The road he had stumbled onto. The one that didn't appear on any map. The one that had led him here. He took a step back, heart pounding in his chest. "How do I leave? I just want to get out." The figure tilted its head slightly, as if studying him. "Leave," it repeated, as if the very concept was foreign to it. "There is no leaving the forgotten highway. No one who walks this path can ever leave. You are here now forever." Paul's stomach dropped. This couldn't be happening. There had to be a way out. "No," the figure continued, its voice growing darker. "There is no way back. Once you are here, you belong to the road. You belong to the mist. And you will walk it until the end of your days. If you are lucky." "Lucky?" Paul repeated, his voice hoarse with disbelief. The figure slowly lifted one arm, and with the movement, a faint glow appeared in the darkness, revealing a small, intricate clock, its hands ticking forward. Paul's breath caught. The clock's hands didn't match up with any normal time. They moved in strange, unpredictable patterns, as if they were counting down to something. The figure's voice dropped lower, almost a whisper, but Paul could hear it clearly in the silence of the cavern. "The forgotten highway has its own time, its own rules. Once you cross it, you are bound to it. You will see things, experience things that should not exist. But time will stretch for you. You will never age. You will never die. and you will never leave. Paul's heart began to race again, faster now, panic seizing him. He looked around frantically, hoping for some way out, but there was nothing. Just the roots, the stone, and the figure. You said I'd never leave. Never age. Paul stammered. That means I'll be stuck here forever, like the others. The figure did not respond, its silence a far worse answer than any words it could speak. It stood there, unmoving, its dark cloak swirling in the still air, as though waiting for Paul to understand the truth. The whispers grew louder, the voices rising in a terrifying crescendo. And slowly, the realization hit Paul, like a weight crashing down on his chest. He wasn't just stuck in this place. He had become part of it. Paul's mind reeled as the figure's words sank in. He had become part of it. The road, the mist, the endless nightmare that stretched on forever. He wasn't just lost. He wasn't just trapped in some forgotten place. He was now part of it. Just another soul condemned to walk the forgotten highway for eternity. The clock's ticking was maddening, each tick louder, faster, as if it was counting down to something he couldn't understand. He could feel the weight of it, pulling at his very soul. His breath quickened, and he stepped back, his eyes darting around, desperately searching for an escape. But there was none. The whispers had stopped for a moment, replaced by a low hum, like the vibration of something ancient, something far older than the world itself. It resonated through the stone beneath his feet, vibrating through his bones, until Paul felt as though the ground was going to open up beneath him and swallow him whole. He turned to face the figure again, his heart pounding painfully in his chest. "What do you want from me?" he asked, his voice cracking with fear. The figure was silent for a long moment, as though considering him. And then finally it spoke again, its voice colder than before, more detached. "What we want from you is nothing." It paused, and Paul felt a chill seep deeper into his bones. "What you are about to do, you will do on your own. The highway never needs to ask. It always gets what it wants in the end." Paul didn't understand. What was it trying to say? He had no time to think about it. His mind was too clouded with panic, with fear. He turned his eyes toward the cavern's walls, searching for a way out, but there was nothing. The roots stretched up like dark fingers, clawing at the stone, pulsing with unnatural life, and the air grew thicker by the second. Then something moved in the distance. A flicker at first, barely perceptible, but it grew stronger, shadowy figures emerging from the darkness, moving toward him with unnatural speed. They were there in the blink of an eye, surrounding him, just like the twisted beings in the house. They were different, though. These figures were tall, their forms humanoid but distorted. Their limbs were elongated, their eyes burning with a ghostly glow. They didn't make a sound. They didn't speak. They just stood there, silent, watching him. And Paul knew they were waiting. He could feel their eyes on him, pressing against him, making his skin crawl. It felt like they were part of the air, part of the stone, part of the road. He wasn't just in their world now. He was with them. The figure in the shadows spoke again, its voice cutting through the heavy air like a blade. "The road has claimed you, traveler." The words echoed in Paul's mind. "But there is no escape. There is only the highway, and its endless path." Paul's legs trembled, his body shaking with terror, and he staggered back, almost tripping over the uneven floor. He needed to leave. He needed to get away from them, from this place. But the closer he moved to the cavern's edge, the more oppressive the air became. It was as if the very shadows were reaching for him, pulling him back, pulling him deeper into the abyss. He heard the rustling of movement behind him, and when he turned, the figures were closer now, closing in on him. Their glowing eyes bored into him, and for the first time he understood there was no leaving. "You will never walk free again," the figure whispered, its voice cold, final. Paul's mind screamed for escape, for something, anything that could free him from this nightmare. But deep down he knew there was no escape. As the figures closed in, he felt himself starting to sink again. The floor beneath him seemed to melt away, the stone giving way to something softer, wetter, like thick mud that clung to his legs. It was pulling him down, dragging him into the ground itself. His body felt heavier, as though something was trying to claim him, to bind him to this place forever. The figures weren't just watching anymore. They were reaching for him, their hands outstretched, their fingers long and thin, their grasp cold as death. His breath quickened, panic rising. He tried to pull away, but it was no use. His legs were trapped, sinking deeper and deeper into the earth. The figure's hands touched his skin, cold and clammy like ice. And then the voice, the same low, ancient whisper, came again, this time not in words, but in thought, reverberating through his mind. "You will become like us." The words echoed, louder this time, and Paul felt his body freeze, his mind slipping, losing its grip on reality. The figures, the shadows, they were all part of it. The highway. He wasn't just trapped here. He had become one of them. One of the lost souls bound to the road, wandering the endless path forever. And then, with one final, desperate scream, Paul's body went still. He didn't know how much time passed. How much of it was real, or just part of the madness that had taken hold of him. But when he awoke, the mist had settled. The road stretched out before him, endless, vanishing into the fog. And Paul was standing in the same place where it had all begun. The same road. The same endless stretch of blacktop, twisted and dark. He took a step forward. His legs felt strange, stiff, as though he hadn't used them in ages. His skin felt cold, alien, and when he looked down at his hands, they were pale, too pale. His heart froze. He didn't recognize himself anymore. And then the whispers returned. 1,000 voices all around him. The road was calling to him again. He was no longer a man on a road trip. He was part of the highway now. Forever. The mist closed in around him, the figures watching from the shadows, waiting for the next lost soul to wander down the path. And Paul walked on. The fog swirled around Paul's feet as he took another step, his movements slow and deliberate, though his mind screamed to run. There was no running, though. No escape. The road stretched out in front of him, twisting into the distance, where the mist blurred everything. He felt the weight of the fog pressing down on him, thick and suffocating, clinging to his skin like a wet blanket. He wanted to look back, to see if the road behind him had changed, if there was any trace of the place he had come from. But the moment his gaze flickered toward the darkness behind him, a sudden sense of dread took hold, and he quickly turned away. There was nothing there that would help him. No answer. The figures were still there, just beyond his line of sight, in the periphery of the mist. He could feel them, watching, waiting. It was as if the very air around him had turned to something else entirely, an ancient thing, filled with memories of all the travelers who had walked this path before him, their souls forever trapped here. The road wasn't just a road. It was a prison, a maze, a place that twisted time and reality into something unrecognizable. And now Paul was part of it. His throat was dry, his lips cracked, as though he hadn't spoken in years, but he needed to say something. Anything. "Hello!" His voice came out hoarse, a mere whisper against the vast emptiness. No answer. He took another step, then another, each movement feeling like an eternity. The road stretched out endlessly, like a serpent winding its way through the thickening fog. It felt as though the ground beneath his feet was shifting, the edges of the road pulling away, vanishing into the dark abyss, leaving nothing but the mist to mark its place. And then he heard it, a soft, distant sound like the hum of an engine. It was faint at first, barely audible, but as it grew closer, Paul realized it was a car on the forgotten highway. His heart skipped a beat. He wasn't alone. The engine roared to life, and then, as if drawn by some unseen force, a car appeared from the mist, its headlights cutting through the darkness like a blade. The car's headlights were blinding, casting strange, distorted shadows across the road. It slowed as it neared him, the tires screeching against the gravel, and finally came to a stop just a few feet in front of him. For a moment, everything was still. Paul's breath hitched in his chest. He could see through the windshield, but there was no driver. The car was empty. The seats were vacant, the windows rolled down, but there was no one behind the wheel. The engine continued to hum, a low, throbbing sound, vibrating through the air. Paul couldn't move. He stood frozen, his mind battling with the reality around him. The car's headlights flickered, and for a brief moment, Paul thought he saw a figure sitting in the back seat. A shadow, just a blur of movement. He squinted, but the figure was gone the next second, swallowed by the fog. Without warning, the car's door creaked open, and Paul felt an irresistible pull. It was as though the vehicle was beckoning him, urging him to climb in, to take his place among the lost. No, Paul whispered to himself, taking a step back. He had to resist. He couldn't go with them, couldn't let the road take him completely. He wanted to shout, to scream for help, but no sound escaped his lips. The fog around him thickened, pressing in on him, tightening like a vice. The door of the car swung wide. The fog parted slightly around the car, and for the first time, Paul could see the seat clearly, though his mind could hardly process what it was showing him. The seat was drenched in dark, viscous liquid. Blood. Thick, clotted blood. It pooled on the floor, the seat soaked through. And in the darkness of the back seat, he saw the faint outline of a body. It was twisted and hunched, limbs in unnatural positions, the face obscured in shadow. But there was something wrong about it. A low groan escaped the figure, as if it was calling to him. "Help me!" The voice was broken, distorted, but unmistakable. It was pleading. "Please!" The words rattled inside his head, making his heart race faster, terror coursing through him. He wanted to look away, to run, but his body refused to move. The air around him was thick, heavy, suffocating. He couldn't tear his gaze from the figure, the whispering voice, the blood-soaked seat. And then, as if summoned by the voice, something shifted in the fog. The figure stirred, rising from the seat, dragging itself out of the car. Its limbs stretched unnaturally long, its body jerking like a marionette pulled by invisible strings. The groaning sound grew louder, more frantic, as the thing made its way toward him, its face still hidden in the shadows. "Help me!" It begged again, its voice hollow and distorted. "Who are you?" Paul managed to gasp, his voice shaking with fear. What do you want from me?" The thing didn't answer. It was coming closer now, its movements jerky and uncoordinated, its body swaying like it was fighting some unseen force. Paul could see its hands now, long, twisted fingers that seemed to stretch with every movement, the skin stretched taut over bone. It reached out for him, the fingers brushing against his arm, cold and clammy, sending a shiver through his body. "Don't touch me!" Paul screamed, finally breaking free of his paralysis. He tried to pull away, but the thing's grip tightened, its fingers digging into his flesh like claws. The pain was sharp, sudden, but it wasn't the worst of it. The worst part was the feeling. It wasn't just the physical pain. It was the presence of the thing. It was like its touch was reaching into him, crawling beneath his skin, twisting something inside of him. His heartbeat thundered in his chest, his vision swimming, and in the back of his mind, he heard the whispers again, louder now. The voices, the lost souls. They were all around him, pressing in. "Please!" The figure groaned, its voice now frantic, desperate. "Help me! Help us!" Paul's chest tightened. He tried to pull away, but the thing wouldn't let go. It was dragging him toward the car now, its body swaying with an unnatural rhythm, as if it was part of the road, part of the mist. "Let me go!" Paul shouted, struggling harder, but the grip only tightened. The thing's face slowly came into view, its features twisted and misshapen, its eyes wide and empty like dark, bottomless wells. The skin was cracked, peeling, the mouth a gaping hole. But it smiled, a horrible, twisted smile. "You can't leave," it whispered, as its grip tightened once more. "None of us ever can." Paul's heart thundered in his chest as the thing's grip tightened further, pulling him inexorably toward the blood-soaked car. The twisted figure's smile widened, grotesque and stretched, its lips cracking as if it had not used them in years, decades, maybe centuries. It was smiling, but there was nothing in its eyes. Only darkness. The kind of darkness that could swallow a person whole. His breath was shallow now, his limbs weak from the unbearable cold that seeped into his bones. Panic surged, and he fought harder, struggling to break free. He pulled and twisted, but the thing only seemed to grow stronger, its hand like a vice, squeezing the life out of him. "Let me go!" Paul screamed, desperation overtaking his reason. The thing's mouth opened wider, the darkness inside it deepening, and the sound of its voice, broken, ancient, echoed in Paul's mind. "You can't escape." The words weren't just spoken, they felt like they were pressed into his skull, sinking into his thoughts. The road had claimed him. The highway had already decided. There was no leaving, no way out. The fog swirled, thick and choking, and Paul felt his feet leave the ground. He was being pulled toward the back seat of the car, toward the waiting darkness. The shadows wrapped around him, and the whispering voices grew louder, merging into a cacophony of sorrow and pain. And then, as if the air had been sucked from his lungs, he was shoved roughly into the car. The door slammed shut behind him, and the car lurched forward, moving without the driver. The headlights burned brighter, cutting through the fog like knives. Paul's body slammed against the seat, but he couldn't move. He was trapped, suffocated by the air inside the car. The fog pressed against the windows, and the world outside disappeared into a whirl of gray. His eyes darted around the interior, searching for any sign of escape. But the back seat was the worst part. It was soaked in the same thick, black liquid as before, the blood, sticky and cold. The scent of it filled his nostrils, thick and metallic, mixing with the stench of rot. He could feel it seeping into his clothes, staining his skin. And then he saw them. The figures. The other souls. They were all there, crammed into the back seat with him. Twisted bodies, broken forms, their eyes wide open but unseeing, their faces contorted in eternal screams. Their skin was stretched tight over their bones, their mouths hanging open in silent pleas, their eyes pleading for help. But there was no help. No one was ever going to help them. Their bodies shifted and writhed, pressing in on him from all sides, their forms becoming one with the shadows. Paul's chest tightened with terror. He wanted to scream, to break free from the car, but his voice was strangled, stuck in his throat. The fog inside the car thickened, wrapping around him like a noose. The sound of the engine was deafening now, the hum of it vibrating through his bones, pounding in his skull. The car picked up speed, racing down the endless, winding road. Paul's vision blurred as the fog closed in, and all he could hear was the relentless, eerie hum of the engine. His mind screamed for him to wake up, to get out of the car, to escape. But it was too late. There was no waking up. There was no escaping. The road had taken him. Time didn't exist in this place. Paul couldn't tell how long he had been in the car, or if he had been there for seconds, hours, or days. The fog never cleared. It wrapped itself around the car like a suffocating shroud, blocking out all light, all hope. And then, with a sharp turn, the car slowed. The figures inside shifted, groaning softly, as though they had been waiting for this moment. Paul looked out the window, his breath shallow and panicked, his eyes scanning the thick fog. Ahead of him, the road split into two. One path was dark, almost completely shrouded in shadow, while the other was brighter, but still wrapped in a dull, unnatural haze. It wasn't much of a choice. The car was already heading toward the darker path. The engine revved, its growl low and menacing. "No!" Paul shouted, slamming his fist against the window, desperate to make the car stop. "Please, take me back." But no one heard him. The figures in the back seat only stared at him, their hollow eyes empty and cold. The car continued on, its tires grinding against the road as it picked up speed. The path before him grew darker and narrower. The fog thickened. The road ahead twisted like a serpent, and with each passing second, it felt as though the darkness was pressing closer, surrounding them on all sides. And then the figure spoke. "You will be one of us." The words echoed in Paul's ears, sinking deep into his mind. He turned toward them, wide-eyed, trembling. "What does that mean?" he whispered, his voice breaking. But there was no answer. The figures just stared at him with those empty, soulless eyes, their faces still frozen in those eternal expressions of horror. The car crept forward, the headlights casting long, distorted shadows on the road ahead. Then, as if the air had suddenly gone still, the fog parted slightly. Paul saw something. A figure standing at the edge of the road, bathed in pale, ghostly light. It was tall, shrouded in a tattered cloak, its face hidden beneath a hood. It didn't move, but its presence was overwhelming, like the embodiment of the road itself. Its outline shimmered, shifting in and out of focus, like a ghost caught between worlds. The car slowed even more as they drew closer, the headlights flickering. The figure stood motionless, its hand outstretched, palm open. For a moment, everything went silent. The engine, the fog, the whispering voices, they all stopped. There was only the figure. And then it spoke, its voice soft and distant, like a whisper carried on the wind. "Welcome home." The words felt like a cold weight on Paul's chest. Welcome home. The figure's voice was chilling, as though it was meant to be a greeting, but in this place, it sounded more like a sentence. Paul's heart raced in his chest, panic surging as the car slowed even more, creeping toward the figure standing at the edge of the road. The fog seemed to part around it, as if the mist itself was yielding to the being before him. He tried to push himself away from the back seat, to open the door, to escape. But the door was locked, sealed shut by some invisible force. His breath came in shallow gasps as the figure's form grew clearer, the edges of its cloak swirling in the dense fog. Its face remained hidden, and that only made the dread in Paul's heart grow stronger. What was it? Who was it? No, Paul muttered to himself, trembling. No, no, no. The car rolled to a stop, and everything was still. The fog hung heavy, thick enough to taste, clinging to the windshield. The engine hummed quietly now, like a heartbeat, rhythmic and unsettling. The figure didn't move, but Paul could feel its presence, looming, watching, waiting. For a moment, the figure stood perfectly still, its dark form barely visible in the mist. Then, without warning, it began to walk toward the car. Slow, deliberate steps. Each one bringing it closer, its cloak dragging along the ground, a tattered reminder of something ancient, something forgotten. Paul's breath caught in his throat as the figure's hand extended further, its fingers long and skeletal, its palms still open, waiting. There was nothing Paul could do. He couldn't run. He couldn't scream. The fog had swallowed the sound of his voice long ago, and his limbs felt heavy, like they were made of stone. The figures in the back seat stared at him, unmoving, their faces locked in eternal despair. The car was their home now, just as it was about to become his. The figure was standing beside the car now, its presence filling the air. Paul felt its gaze, though he couldn't see its face. His skin crawled, his body stiff with fear. Every part of him screamed for him to escape, but it was as though the car had become a cage, and the road had become a trap. The figure's voice, soft but clear, broke the silence. "You have reached the end of your journey." The words sliced through Paul's mind like a knife. End of your journey. His stomach churned. The weight of the phrase settled on him, as if he had been walking toward this moment all along, and now there was no turning back. There was no escape. This road, this forgotten highway, had claimed him, just like it had claimed the others. The figure's hand hovered near the window, its fingers curling slightly as though beckoning Paul to roll it down. But Paul didn't move. He couldn't. His body was frozen, locked in place, his mind consumed by the realization that he was now a part of something ancient and unending. And then, the figure's voice whispered again, low and insistent. "You belong to this place now. Before Paul could react, the window beside him creaked open. The air outside was thick, cold, and damp. It smelled of decay, of things long dead. The fog pressed against his skin like 1,000 unseen hands, pushing him toward the figure. Suddenly, the figure bent low, its face emerging from beneath the hood. Paul's heart skipped a beat as he saw the thing's eyes, black as coal, hollow and empty, as though they had never seen light. There was no emotion in them, no recognition, just an endless void. The face was like nothing Paul had ever seen, twisted, contorted, like a mask that had been worn too long. The skin was stretched tight, thin and pale, veins creeping beneath the surface like cracks in porcelain. The mouth was wide, too wide, its lips cracked and dry, as if it hadn't spoken in centuries. And yet it smiled. It was a smile that sent waves of ice through Paul's veins, a grin that seemed to stretch beyond what was natural. The thing was not human. It never had been. It was something else, something old, something that had existed long before roads or cities or people. Paul tried to scream, but the sound died in his throat, strangled by the terror that gripped him. He tried to move, to run, but his body wouldn't respond. He was trapped in the car, trapped by the thing, trapped by the road. The figure leaned in closer, its foul breath washing over him. It smelled of decay, of death. "You're not the first," it whispered, its voice a rasping hiss. "But you will be the last." Paul's chest tightened. He didn't understand. He couldn't make sense of the words. The last? What did it mean? His mind raced, the fog inside his brain growing thicker, blurring everything. And then the fog parted again. The mist receded, just enough to reveal the road ahead. Paul's heart pounded as he looked down the winding path, twisting into the shadows. The road that had claimed him, the road that had claimed them all. The car started moving again, slowly at first, but then it picked up speed, rolling forward as though it was alive, as though it was the one driving. Paul's body jerked with emotion, his seatbelt digging into his chest, but he couldn't tear his eyes away from the figure standing by the side of the road. It watched him as the car carried him further into the darkness. The engine hummed louder now, its sound overwhelming, drowning out the whispers in the back seat. The fog began to thin, but the darkness that replaced it was just as suffocating. Paul looked out the window, his heart hammering. The road ahead was endless, winding, and now he saw what he had feared most. There were more cars on the road, hundreds of them, thousands. Their headlights cut through the mist, illuminating broken and twisted figures inside. They were all the same, the lost souls, the ones who had driven down this highway and never returned. Some were still in their cars, others had gotten out, wandering aimlessly in the fog. All of them had that same vacant, hollow stare. All of them trapped, just like Paul. The road stretched endlessly in front of him, pulling him forward into the abyss. The car sped onward, its tires screeching as it cut through the fog. Paul's vision blurred, and every inch of his body trembled with fear. The souls in the other cars were becoming more numerous now, their forms distorted, twisted, like they were trapped between life and death, lost in a never-ending nightmare. The headlights illuminated their hollow faces for a brief moment before the darkness swallowed them again. There was no escape, no turning back. The road had claimed him, and now he was one of them, a part of the lost, doomed to wander in the fog forever. "Help, someone," Paul whispered, his voice shaking as he turned to the figures in the back seat, the ones who had been with him since he had entered the car. They remained silent, their eyes wide but unseeing, their mouths frozen in silent screams. They were no longer people, they were just shadows, trapped in a world that existed outside of time. He reached out to them, but his hand passed through their forms like smoke. Then, without warning, the car came to an abrupt stop. Paul's body jerked forward, slamming into the seatbelt as the engine's hum fell silent. The fog, thick and suffocating, surrounded them completely. It was as if the world had collapsed into this small, confined space. Just the car, the fog, and the endless road stretching on forever. He looked up. The figure was standing in front of the car now, its form towering over the vehicle, blocking the road ahead. The creature's empty, coal-black eyes were fixed on Paul, its skeletal hand raised, palm outstretched, as if commanding him to step out. The car doors unlocked with an audible click, and before Paul could even comprehend what was happening, the door beside him swung open. The chill air from the outside flooded in, thick with the smell of decay and something far older, something ancient and forgotten. The fog pressed against his skin, as though trying to drag him out. "Get out!" the figure whispered again, its voice barely audible but filled with an undeniable authority. Paul's heart raced. Every instinct in his body screamed for him to stay inside, to lock the doors and never leave the safety of the car. But the figure's presence was overwhelming. It seemed to draw the very air from his lungs, suffocating him. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. He had to go. He had to step out. He didn't know why, but the pull was undeniable, like a thread tying him to the figure, to the road. Slowly, his legs moved, his body rising from the seat as if it were being controlled by something beyond his will. "No, I can't. I don't want this," Paul whispered, his voice breaking. He tried to resist, but the feeling in his chest was like a weight too heavy to bear. His feet hit the ground, his boots sinking into the soft, damp earth as he stepped out of the car. The figure was still there, waiting. Its cloak fluttered in the wind, and Paul's eyes darted to the road behind him. The endless line of cars, the endless line of souls, stretched as far as he could see. But there was no turning back. The fog had already consumed everything. "It's time to walk the path," the figure intoned, its voice low, like a distant echo. "You will not return. The highway is your home now. Forever." Paul's chest tightened. He couldn't breathe, couldn't think. Every part of him wanted to run, to escape, but his feet were rooted to the ground, planted in the very soil of the forgotten road. It felt like the earth beneath him was pulling him deeper into its grip, dragging him further into the fog. The figure stepped closer, its skeletal hand reaching out once more. "Follow me." And without another word, it turned and began walking down the darkened path. Paul, unable to stop himself, took a step forward, then another. The road beneath his feet felt different now, soft, as though the asphalt had turned to something else, something organic, like the ground itself was alive. Every step was heavier than the last. His legs felt as though they were sinking with each movement, his body growing colder and colder. He glanced back at the car, but it had vanished into the fog, swallowed by the same darkness that seemed to consume everything around him. "Where am I?" Paul whispered to no one, his voice lost in the vast emptiness. The figure didn't answer. It simply walked ahead, its long strides purposeful, its cloak billowing behind it like a shroud. Paul's eyes followed the figure's movements, his mind racing, trying to make sense of this nightmare. Where had the road taken him? What was this place? The fog parted briefly, revealing glimpses of the road ahead. Twisted trees, their gnarled branches reaching out like skeletal fingers, and the twisted remnants of broken signs, all covered in thick layers of moss. The road ahead looked abandoned, old and forgotten, as if time itself had no meaning here. And then he saw them, the souls, the others. They were scattered along the road, some kneeling, some standing, all with their heads bowed. Their eyes were hollow, their bodies emaciated and frail. Their faces were etched with pain and despair. They didn't speak. They didn't move. But Paul could feel their eyes on him, cold, unblinking, watching, judging. They were all waiting. The figure turned toward him suddenly, its gaze fixed on him. "You have joined them now. You will walk with them for eternity." The words hit Paul like a physical blow. His breath caught in his throat. He had been so focused on the road ahead, on the figure guiding him, that he hadn't noticed. He was just like them now, a lost soul, a prisoner of the forgotten highway. He opened his mouth to scream, but no sound came out. His voice had been stolen, just as his hope had been stolen. The road was his prison. The fog was his cage. And there was no escape. There never had been. The weight of the words sank in. Paul was no longer just a traveler, a man on a road trip. He was a part of the forgotten highway now, a part of the endless procession that moved like ghosts through the fog. His mind screamed for release, for a way out, but the road stretched before him, unyielding, a path that twisted into oblivion. The figure, this thing, was still walking ahead, its cloak dragging through the damp earth, and Paul followed without a choice. Every step felt like a surrender. His body obeyed, but his soul fought, clinging to the remnants of a life he couldn't fully remember. Was it real? The world he'd come from? Was he ever truly alive, or had he always been a part of this endless road? He glanced over at the souls around him, those who had come before. They moved like shadows, a parade of the lost, their faces blank and hollow, their bodies emaciated. They wandered the highway as if they were waiting for something, though no one ever came. Their eyes never met Paul's, their gaze never wavered from the road. Some were whispering, but the sound was muffled, distant, like an echo from a time long past. There were no landmarks on this highway. No signs, no exits, nothing to suggest that this was once a place of life, of movement. Only the never-ending fog, the ever-widening emptiness, and the oppressive feeling of being trapped in a place that didn't exist on any map. Where am I going? Paul's voice was weak, barely more than a whisper, but the figure heard him nonetheless. Without stopping, the figure turned its head, its coal-black eyes locking onto Paul's. You are going where you belong. The words sent a cold shiver down Paul's spine. He opened his mouth to ask more, but the words caught in his throat. It was as if the air itself had thickened, suffocating him with its weight. Every breath felt harder to take. The fog pressed closer, wrapping itself around him like a living thing, its tendrils winding around his legs, pulling at him, making it harder to move. But move he did, step after step. There was nothing else to do. Hours, days, time itself seemed to lose all meaning here. The road stretched on endlessly, curving around trees that looked more like twisted sculptures than actual plants. Their limbs reached out like claws, scratching the sky in vain. The souls shuffled along the edges of the road, silent, drifting. No one spoke. No one tried to escape. They were all bound by the same fate. And then Paul saw something new. A figure ahead of him, standing by the side of the road. A man tall and thin, his face obscured by the hood of his tattered coat. He stood still as though waiting. The fog parted just enough for Paul to catch a glimpse of him. But as soon as Paul's eyes locked onto the figure, the fog closed in again, hiding him from view. It was strange. This was the first figure he had seen that wasn't moving, that wasn't a part of the endless procession. Something about it stood out, like it didn't belong in this place. Who is that? Paul found himself asking, his voice thick with fear and curiosity. The figure didn't answer. Instead, it took a single step forward, moving away from the side of the road, disappearing into the mist once again. Paul's heart raced, and he took a hesitant step toward where the figure had been. But before he could take another step, the figure was gone, lost in the fog. The figure that had been guiding him, that presence in front of him, stopped walking too, turning slowly to face Paul. "You do not belong here anymore," it said, its voice as cold as the fog surrounding them. Paul's pulse quickened. He didn't understand. What did it mean? What was happening? "You are no longer one of the lost," the figure continued, its head tilting slightly. "But you are not free. No one who enters this place is free. We are all bound to it. Forever. I don't want to be here. I want to leave." Paul's voice cracked. His words were desperate, but he could feel them fall away into the fog, disappearing as soon as they left his lips. The figure moved again, its footsteps eerily silent against the earth. It passed by Paul without a word, continuing down the road, the tattered cloak swirling behind it. Paul, feeling a mix of fear and desperation, turned to follow. He wasn't sure what would happen next, but he couldn't stay here. He couldn't let this road claim him completely. But with every step he took, something felt wrong. The air grew colder, the fog thicker. It was as though the world around him was closing in, as if the very land itself was pressing against him, suffocating him. The road was stretching further into the endless night, and he could feel the pull of it, like a force pulling him deeper into the abyss. And then something else caught his eye. The sky above, which had been an eternal shade of gray, began to change. The faintest hint of red appeared on the horizon, creeping in like the first signs of an impending storm. At first, it was just a flicker, but it grew, slowly filling the sky, casting an eerie, blood-red glow over everything. The fog seemed to thicken, swirling and twisting in unnatural patterns. Paul stopped in his tracks, staring at the sky as it bled into a darker, deeper red. It felt like the world was bleeding, like everything around him was being consumed by some terrible force. The figure didn't stop. It kept walking, its movements unnervingly calm, as though it didn't notice the sky, the strange shift in the air. But Paul could feel it. The change. Something was wrong. Something was coming. "What is happening?" Paul whispered, his voice hoarse as the red light grew brighter. The figure's voice was cold, distant, and final. "You are home now." Paul's chest tightened. Home? This was not home. This was a nightmare. He had to escape. There had to be a way. But before he could move, the road beneath his feet shifted again. The ground trembled. A low rumbling sound began to rise, like the growl of something ancient and hungry. And then the highway changed. The ground trembled beneath Paul's feet, the very road beneath him twisting and warping like the veins of some ancient creature waking from its long slumber. The rumbling sound grew louder, echoing through the fog. The sky above pulsed with that unnatural red glow, and for a moment, Paul could have sworn he saw shapes moving in the mist, dark, formless shapes that twisted and writhed just at the edge of his vision, but when he looked directly at them, they vanished. He turned to look at the figure in front of him. The being seemed unfazed, unaffected by the distortion of the world around them. Its head was turned slightly to the side, as if it were listening to something Paul couldn't hear. Its coal-black eyes flickered with something. Satisfaction? Anticipation? "What's happening?" Paul asked, his voice trembling, almost pleading. The figure didn't respond at first. It simply stood there, its long cloak swaying in the growing wind, the mist swirling around it like a living thing. And then, without any warning, the figure spoke again, its voice barely more than a whisper, but it carried in the air like a distant thunderclap. "The road is awakening," it said. "It has waited so long, and now it is time." A chill ran down Paul's spine. The road? Awakening? What did that mean? The ground beneath him seemed to pulse now, as if it had a life of its own. The trees around them, their skeletal branches reaching into the sky, seemed to twitch in the growing wind. The fog, once thick and suffocating, now seemed to swirl in tight spirals, moving in patterns that looked disturbingly deliberate. Then, as if in response to the figure's words, the ground split open. A deep, gaping crack appeared in the middle of the road, the earth splitting wide with a horrifying creak. The sound was deafening, like the bones of the earth being pulled apart. The crack widened, revealing a yawning abyss beneath them, dark, empty, a void that seemed to stretch on forever. "No, no, no," Paul muttered, his heart racing as the sight of the abyss filled him with pure, unadulterated terror. "This isn't real. This can't be real." But the figure was unfazed. It stepped toward the crack, its movements calm, almost peaceful, as if this was exactly what it had been waiting for. "It is real, and it will never end," it said, turning its empty gaze to Paul. "This place is where all roads end. The road is eternal. And so are you." The words echoed in Paul's ears, but they didn't bring comfort, only dread. Every instinct in his body screamed for him to run, to turn around and flee, but his feet were frozen to the ground. The crack in the road widened further, and from the depths of the abyss, something began to emerge. At first, it was just a whisper of movement, a shadow rising from the darkness below. But then more shadows joined it. Figures, hundreds of them, crawling up from the depths of the earth. Their movements were jerky, unnatural, like marionettes controlled by invisible strings. They were human in shape, but distorted, grotesque, faces twisted in eternal agony, their bodies contorted in unnatural angles. They crawled out of the crack like insects, their hands scraping against the earth as they pulled themselves upward, their mouths open in silent screams. Paul stepped back, his breath catching in his throat. His legs wobbled, and he stumbled backward, but the figure's gaze never left him. The souls that had been following the figure were now surrounding the crack, watching the new arrivals with empty eyes. They didn't move. They didn't speak. They were just waiting. "This is what happens to those who take the road," the figure said, its voice calm, almost comforting. "You become part of the road. You become part of the endless journey. There is no escape." The crawling figures continued to emerge from the abyss, pulling themselves out of the crack and onto the road, their faces twisted in silent, eternal suffering. Paul's heart raced as he realized that these were the lost souls, those who had walked the highway before him, those who had been claimed by it, transformed into these twisted, crawling things. What are they?" Paul gasped, his voice barely a whisper. The figure finally turned its attention away from the abyss, fixing its gaze on Paul with an intensity that made his skin crawl. "They are what you will become, what we all become. The road takes everything. It takes your past, your name, your memories, your soul." Paul's knees buckled, and he sank to the ground, unable to look away from the crawling figures. They were getting closer now, moving toward him with terrifying speed. Their hands scraped against the asphalt, their faces frozen in expressions of pain and despair. Each step they took seemed to pull the very life from the air, draining the world of warmth and hope. No, I don't want this. I don't want to be like them," Paul cried, his voice breaking as he clawed at the earth beneath him, trying to push himself away from the figures, from the abyss. But it was too late. The road had already claimed him. The figure stepped forward, its cold hand reaching out to Paul. "There is no turning back. You are one of us now. Welcome home." And as it touched him, a cold, suffocating darkness washed over him. His body went numb, his mind clouded with an overwhelming sense of loss. His memories, the ones that had seemed so clear just moments ago, began to slip away like sand through his fingers. Faces, names, places, all of them blurred and faded into the abyss. His sense of self began to unravel, piece by piece. Paul screamed, but no sound came out. The souls around him, those who had already lost themselves, were moving closer, reaching out, their hands brushing against his skin like cold tendrils. The fog thickened, the ground trembled again, and the crack in the road yawned wider. The abyss called to him, its endless void pulling him deeper, dragging him down into the dark. And as he was swallowed by the shadows, Paul realized the terrible truth. There was no escape. There was only the road, the forgotten highway, the place where all roads end. And now he was part of it, lost forever in the fog, wandering through an eternity of suffering and silence. Paul's world was nothing but darkness now. The fog, thick and suffocating, seemed to press in from every direction, blocking out any hope of escape. He could no longer feel his body as he once had. The coldness had seeped into his very bones, and his thoughts were a jumbled mess, slipping away from him like water through his fingers. His mind clawed at the fragments of memories, but each one fell apart before he could grasp it, like a dream fading upon waking. He tried to scream, to call out, but no sound came. The road, or what was left of it, stretched before him like an endless, unyielding stretch of nothing. The figures, the souls, were there, surrounding him now, their hollow eyes staring at him with a blankness that chilled him to the core. Their movements were slow, deliberate, but they made no sound. They didn't speak, didn't even acknowledge his presence anymore. They were all the same, shadows, ghosts, echoes of what they once were. And then something else changed. A shape moved in the distance, something larger than the crawling figures. A presence, cold and heavy, that seemed to draw the fog closer, tightening it around Paul like a trap. He turned toward it, his heart racing, though he didn't understand why. The shape loomed larger as it approached, and with every step, the air seemed to grow heavier, more oppressive. His vision blurred, and for a moment, he thought he saw a face. A face that wasn't a part of the fog or the darkness, a face that was almost human. But then, the shape moved into clearer view. It was a man, tall and thin, with a face that was half hidden in the shadows of a wide-brimmed hat. His clothes were tattered, like the others, but there was something different about him. Something familiar. He held a lantern in his hand, the light flickering weakly against the overpowering darkness. "Who are you?" Paul tried to ask, but his voice was still silent, trapped inside his throat. The figure didn't answer at first. He merely stepped closer, his lantern casting long, flickering shadows across the road. The light felt cold, distant, and yet it seemed to draw Paul in, beckoning him to follow. But Paul didn't want to follow. Not anymore. He didn't want to go deeper into whatever nightmare this was. He had seen the truth of the road, and it terrified him. But the figure, he moved closer still. The lantern's light seemed to flicker more rapidly, casting long shadows that made Paul's skin crawl. Finally, the figure spoke, his voice a soft rasp, as if it had not been used in years. "You've come a long way, traveler." Paul's heart pounded in his chest. Traveler? Was he talking to him? Paul tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. He could only watch as the man raised the lantern, the pale light flickering against the fog. "You'll find your way soon," the man continued, his voice soft, like a wind through dead trees. "You're almost there. Just a little further, and you'll know what you need to know." The words sent a cold shock through Paul. What did that mean? What did he need to know? The man tilted his head, as if considering Paul's confusion. "The road claims all who walk it. It knows your fears, your regrets, your deepest desires. It shows you what you are meant to see. It shows you the truth." Paul's breath caught in his throat. The road had already shown him what it had claimed, what it had done to him. He was no longer himself. His memories were slipping away, and his identity was fading like smoke in the wind. What more did the road want from him? "The road will never stop," the man said, his voice distant now, like a memory from another life. "It has claimed you just as it claims all. You walk it now, forever." Paul's pulse quickened. He didn't want this. He didn't want to be claimed. He didn't want to be lost to the road. He tried to move, to run, but his legs were no longer his own. His body was no longer his own. He was bound to this place, tied to the road by something darker than the fog that surrounded him. The figure with the lantern continued to move away from him, slowly, but Paul could feel it. He could feel the weight of its presence. The figure turned his head, locking eyes with Paul for a brief, unsettling moment. "The road remembers all," the man said, his voice like the distant murmur of the wind. "It will remember you too." And with that, the figure stepped into the fog, disappearing into the swirling darkness. Paul stood there, his heart pounding in his chest, his body trembling with fear and confusion. He was alone again, surrounded by the silent souls and the ever-encroaching fog. The road stretched out in front of him, an endless path that went on forever, the darkness ahead swallowing all light, all hope. But as Paul turned to continue walking, something shifted. The ground beneath him, which had once felt so solid, now seemed to shift and writhe with a life of its own. The air grew heavier still, as though the weight of the road itself was pressing down on him, trying to drag him into the abyss that lay below. He stumbled forward, his body moving without his command. The souls around him, those that had been walking with him, that had been lost before him, moved too, but they were slower, their movements jerky and disjointed. As Paul walked, his steps grew more frantic, and the world around him twisted. The trees around him began to stretch, their branches reaching down like tendrils. The fog thickened even further, and soon, Paul could no longer see anything beyond the thin veil of mist that pressed close to his face. His breaths came in short gasps, panic rising in his chest. He could feel something behind him, something waiting. The road had claimed him. He had no choice but to walk it now. There was no way out. The only thing left to do was keep moving, keep walking, keep going, because if he stopped now, he knew the road would claim him entirely, and he would never be anything more than a shadow. The sound of Paul's footsteps echoed in the emptiness, but even they seemed muffled, swallowed by the thick fog that hung heavy in the air. Every direction he looked, the same endless road stretched before him, barren, twisted, and unyielding. The trees that lined the path had long since lost their shape, their skeletal branches reaching out like claws, gnarled and dark against the crimson sky. The ground beneath him felt soft, almost like it was shifting under his feet, and with each step, the very earth seemed to bend in strange, unnatural ways. He couldn't stop moving. His legs burned with the effort, but it wasn't his body that was making him walk. Something else was in control. Something invisible, something far darker than the road itself. He could feel it pulling him forward, and every time he tried to turn back, the landscape around him warped, the road twisting in on itself, leading him back to where he started. No matter how hard he fought, he couldn't break free. His mind was clouded now, no longer able to grasp at his memories. Faces, places, sounds, they were all fading, slipping through his mind like water through a sieve. The longer he walked, the more he forgot. His name, his purpose, why he had started this journey in the first place. Every step pulled him deeper into this endless loop, into this prison of fog and twisted trees, until everything felt as though it no longer mattered. All that existed now was the road, the forgotten highway. His breath came in shallow gasps, his chest tight with dread. He wanted to scream, to shout, to do anything to break the silence, but the air was so thick, so dense, that even his thoughts felt muffled. The world around him had become a blur of fog and shadows, and the road beneath him no longer felt like something real. It felt alive. The trees, the ground, the air. Everything was a part of the road now. Everything was a part of this cursed place. The shadows that drifted between the trees seemed to have substance, like they were waiting, watching, biding their time. And then through the fog, he saw something moving ahead. At first, it was just a faint shape in the distance, something indistinct and blurry. But as he drew closer, it became clearer. A figure. It was tall, draped in dark rags that fluttered in the wind. It stood motionless, facing the road, and its head was tilted upward, as though it were waiting for something. Paul's heart skipped a beat. It wasn't the same as the other souls. This one was different. It wasn't one of the twisted figures that crawled from the cracks of the earth, and it didn't move like them, jerking and twitching in broken movements. No, this figure was still, its presence somehow more solid, more grounded than the others. Without thinking, Paul moved toward it. His feet carried him forward, drawn to the figure like a moth to a flame. His pulse raced in his ears as he approached, and his breath quickened. Something about the figure was familiar, something that stirred deep within him, but he couldn't place it. His mind was too clouded to make sense of anything, but he felt the need to get closer. He had to. The figure remained still as he came to stand in front of it, its face hidden beneath a hood, its body cloaked in shadows. Paul swallowed hard, but he didn't speak. The figure hadn't moved, hadn't acknowledged him in any way. It was just there waiting. Then, without warning, the figure raised its hand, slowly, deliberately. The air around Paul grew colder, and a sudden chill swept through him, making his skin prickle. The figure's hand was reaching for him, its fingers long and slender, stretching out toward his face. Paul stepped back instinctively, but before he could retreat any further, the figure spoke. "You've come far, traveler," it said, its voice soft, like a whisper carried on the wind. Paul's breath caught in his throat. The voice was like the wind, like an echo from some distant time, yet it felt so familiar, like something he had heard before but could not remember. A memory danced at the edge of his mind, but it was just out of reach. What do you want?" Paul asked, his voice trembling, his mind spinning. "Who are you?" The figure remained silent for a moment, its gaze never leaving him, even though he could not see its eyes. Its hand was still extended toward him, like an invitation or a warning. "I am what you are becoming," the figure finally said, its voice low, almost regretful. "I am what all of us become when the road claims us." Paul's heart pounded in his chest. What did that mean? He was becoming what? He didn't understand. "What are you talking about?" he asked, his voice rising with panic. "I don't." Before he could finish, the figure's hand touched his cheek, and a cold wave of dread washed over him, freezing his thoughts. The fog seemed to close in tighter around him, and suddenly, he was no longer standing on solid ground. His legs buckled beneath him, and he felt himself fall. But there was no impact, no crashing to the ground. Instead, he felt himself sink, slowly, gently, as though the very earth beneath him was swallowing him whole. The ground beneath him gave way, and in the blink of an eye, the landscape around him changed. He was no longer standing on the road, but instead in a place of deep darkness, where the only light came from the faint, flickering glow of a distant lantern. He was alone now, surrounded by a thick, choking blackness that swallowed everything else. The fog had vanished, replaced by an overwhelming sense of isolation. The road, the trees, the figures, all of it was gone. And in its place, there was nothing but the sound of his own heartbeat. And then he heard it, a voice soft at first, but growing louder. "You are lost," it said, its tone sorrowful. "You will never leave this place. There is no way out. You are part of the road now." Paul's breath quickened, and his chest tightened. His heart raced in panic, but it was futile. The darkness pressed in on him from every side. The sense of being trapped was suffocating, like a vice around his chest. "No," he gasped. "No, I won't." But the voice continued, steady, unwavering. "The road never ends. It stretches on forever, and you will walk it for all eternity. This is your fate. This is your path." Paul's body began to tremble, his legs growing weak beneath him. His mind raced, his thoughts swirling in a chaotic frenzy. But no matter how much he struggled, he couldn't escape. The road had claimed him. It had claimed them all. There was only the road now, the forgotten highway, and there would never be any way out. The darkness around Paul was thick, almost suffocating, and he found it difficult to breathe. His chest felt tight, his heart hammering against his ribs as if trying to break free. Every direction he looked was swallowed by the black void. The air around him felt wrong, heavy with something he couldn't name, and he was paralyzed with fear. "There's no escape," the voice whispered again, closer this time, echoing all around him. It was soft, but it carried an unsettling weight, like the words had been spoken from some far-off place that held an ancient, inevitable truth. Paul clenched his fists, trying to shake the dread that crawled up his spine. No, I don't believe you," he cried out, though his voice was weak, barely a whisper in the endless expanse of darkness. For a brief moment, there was silence. The kind of silence that felt as if everything in the world had stopped moving, like the very air itself had paused to listen. Then the voice returned. Not a whisper now, but louder, colder. "You don't have a choice." Paul staggered forward, trying to find some ground beneath him, but his feet felt as if they were sinking into something soft, something thick and sticky. He tried to run, but his legs wouldn't obey. They felt like lead, dragging him deeper into the void. Panic took hold, and he stumbled forward, arms outstretched as if reaching for something, anything, that could help him escape. And then, through the darkness, a faint light appeared. It was small at first, a pinprick of pale, flickering light, but it grew larger the more he struggled toward it. The light felt real, like a spark of hope that had been hidden beneath the heavy fog of dread. He pushed forward, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The further he walked, the brighter the light became, until it engulfed him entirely. It was warm and inviting, and for a moment, Paul thought he could feel something familiar, something like life. But as he stepped forward, the light shifted. It wasn't just light anymore. It was a place, a room. He blinked, his surroundings changing so quickly that his head spun. One moment, he was surrounded by suffocating darkness, and the next, he was standing in a dimly lit room, a place that felt almost real. But it wasn't. It couldn't be. The walls were cracked, peeling, like the decay of some long-forgotten place. The air smelled damp, like mildew and rot. The only furniture in the room was an old, broken chair sitting in the center. And sitting in that chair, bathed in the soft, flickering light, was the figure. The man with the lantern, the one who had warned him. But now his face was clearer, his expression sharper. There was a recognition in the man's gaze, as though he knew Paul, as though they had met before. You, Paul began, his voice shaking. I remember you. From before. From the road. The figure nodded, but his expression remained unchanged. I told you, didn't I? You would remember. Paul's heart beat faster, and his legs trembled beneath him. What is this place? What do you want from me? He demanded, trying to step back, but the room seemed to shrink with every step. The figure slowly stood from the chair, lantern in hand, his gaze never leaving Paul. This is where the road brings those who can still remember. Those who still have a part of themselves left to lose. Paul's breath caught in his throat. Remember? He didn't understand. What did that mean? What did he have left? There's nothing left of me, Paul whispered, barely able to get the words out. I've lost everything. I can't remember anything anymore. The figure tilted his head, the lantern's light flickering softly as he stepped toward Paul. That's the part that's most dangerous, traveler. You're still holding on to something, aren't you? You're still fighting it. But you can't fight the road. Not now. Not anymore. Paul shook his head, his hands gripping his head in desperation. No, please. I don't belong here. I don't belong on this road. I want to go back. I want to leave. The figure smiled faintly, a cold, distant expression. That's the thing. You never left, Paul. You never left the road. It's always been there, waiting, for you to come home. The words hit him like a wave crashing against his chest. Home. Home was that even real anymore? He couldn't remember. His heart pounded as confusion and fear overwhelmed him. No, this isn't real. I'm not. His voice broke, and his knees buckled beneath him. He collapsed onto the floor, his vision swimming with darkness again. The figure's voice cut through the fog in his mind. It's real enough. You've been on the road longer than you know. All of us have. We're the lost ones. We're the ones who never escape. Paul felt something within him stir, something that almost felt like memory, but it slipped away before he could grasp it. The fog in his mind had thickened again, the weight of it pressing down, suffocating him. And then the figure spoke again, his voice softer now, but carrying an eerie finality. You'll understand soon enough. The road doesn't care who you were. It only cares who you become. You'll walk it forever. We all do. The lantern's light flickered one last time before going out entirely, and with it, the room plunged into darkness once more. Paul's chest tightened as the shadows closed in around him. His mind spun, and he felt himself sinking again into a deep, consuming void. There was no escape. There was no way out. There was only the road, and he was already on it. Paul's thoughts were scattered, as if a storm had torn through his mind, leaving only fragments in its wake. The darkness pressed in, thick and cold, and the oppressive silence wrapped around him like a shroud. His breath came in short, sharp gasps, his chest rising and falling as though he couldn't fill his lungs fully, as though the air itself was too dense to breathe. The road, it wasn't just a place anymore. It had become a part of him, seeping into his bones, twisting his thoughts, and swallowing his memories. Every step he took now felt as if he was sinking deeper into something dark, something ancient. He was lost, and he could feel it. He could feel the grip of the forgotten highway tightening around him, pulling him further from anything he once knew. His hands trembled as they reached out in search of something, anything, to ground him, but there was nothing. The void stretched endlessly in every direction, an infinite expanse of nothingness. And then, slowly, a sound emerged from the silence. A distant noise, faint but growing louder. The unmistakable sound of footsteps. Paul froze, his heart pounding in his chest. The footsteps were slow, deliberate, like someone walking toward him in the dark. But there was no one there. No one he could see. The darkness was so thick that he couldn't even make out his own hands, let alone another person. The footsteps grew louder, closer now, and suddenly, the figure appeared once again, just as it had before, standing in the darkness, its tall, shadowy form barely visible against the fog. The lantern hung from its hand, casting a dim, flickering light that did nothing to pierce the depth of the blackness surrounding them. "You've been walking too long, haven't you?" the figure asked, its voice soft, almost like a whisper carried on the wind. Paul's stomach churned. He didn't want to hear it. He didn't want to hear any more. But the words seemed to seep into him like poison, feeding on his fear. "I'm not lost," Paul whispered, his voice hoarse. "I'm not lost." The figure said nothing in reply, only continued to stare at him, the lantern's light swaying with every slight movement of the figure's hand. "You think you still have time," it said, its voice low and heavy. "But time isn't real here. There is only the road." Paul's breath quickened. He couldn't look away from the figure. "What do you want from me?" he asked, his voice barely more than a breath. The figure's eyes, though hidden beneath its hood, seemed to pierce through the darkness. "I don't want anything from you, Paul. I'm not the one who keeps you here. It's the road." The words sent a chill down his spine. The road. It was like the words themselves had weight, as if they carried with them the truth he had been avoiding, a truth that had been waiting for him all along. "You've been walking this road for so long that you don't even remember when it started. The road doesn't care about your past," the figure continued, its voice now echoing in the silence. "It doesn't care about who you were. It only cares about what you become." Paul's legs trembled beneath him. "No, I don't," his voice faltered, and he closed his eyes, trying to push the words away, but they lingered in his mind. The image of the road, of the forgotten highway, burned into his thoughts. "You can't leave," the figure whispered, stepping closer. "None of us can. The road calls to us, and we obey. There's no way out." Paul opened his eyes again, and suddenly, the world around him shifted. The road was there, stretching infinitely before him. The trees loomed overhead like dark sentinels, their twisted branches reaching out, clawing at the fog. He looked down at his feet. The road, it was alive, wasn't it? It twisted and shifted beneath him, as though it were responding to his every movement, pulling him further into its grasp. "No," Paul gasped, stepping back, but the road didn't allow him to. It was like the earth itself had grabbed hold of him, keeping him rooted to the spot. "There's no way out," the figure repeated, its voice a cold whisper. "You're part of it now. You've always been part of it, and the road will never let you go." Panic surged through Paul. He fought against the pull of the road, his hands reaching out in desperation, but it was useless. The more he struggled, the more the road seemed to tighten its hold, dragging him back to where he had started. The figure raised its hand, and for a moment, Paul thought it might strike him, but instead, it simply pointed toward the horizon, where the road disappeared into the fog. "Look ahead, Paul," the figure said. "Look at what awaits you. What awaits all of us." Paul's gaze followed the figure's hand, and his breath caught in his throat. There, just beyond the mist, he saw it. A faint glow, like the pale flicker of a distant lantern, but it wasn't just one light. It was dozens, hundreds, all scattered along the road, floating like will-o'-the-wisps, glowing softly in the fog. And with each light, he saw them, the figures, the lost souls wandering aimlessly along the road, their bodies twisted and broken. Some of them stumbled, others crawled, their movements jerky and unnatural. Their faces were obscured by shadows, but Paul could feel their eyes on him, all of them, their gazes heavy with the weight of their eternal suffering. The road was alive with them. The figure spoke again, its voice almost sympathetic now. These are the ones who didn't understand. The ones who fought too long, who tried to escape. They're here, trapped, just like you will be. Forever. Paul's heart pounded in his chest. The darkness pressed in closer, the figure's words reverberating in his ears. His mind swirled with terror, and for a moment he couldn't breathe. The road, the endless road, stretched before him, and all he could see were the glowing lights, the figures trapped in their endless, futile journey. He could feel the road beneath him, the pull of it, the weight of it. It was calling to him, wrapping around him like chains. He wanted to scream, to run, to escape, but there was no escape. There never was. "Marie," he called out, his voice hoarse with disbelief. The figure turned slowly, revealing a face that made Paul's blood run cold. It wasn't Marie. It was someone else. Someone he didn't recognize. Her eyes were hollow, her skin pale and stretched tight over her skull. Her mouth opened, and her voice came, but it wasn't Marie's. It was something darker, colder. "You think you can still find her?" The figure hissed, its lips curling into a grotesque smile. "You think you can escape?" The fog thickened, the figure's image distorting, warping, and Paul's world tilted once more, slipping back into the suffocating darkness. The road was all that remained, and it was never going to let him go. Paul's breath caught in his throat as the figure in front of him distorted, its face melting into something unrecognizable. The hollow eyes, the twisted mouth, and the skin stretched too tightly across its bones. None of it made sense, but it didn't matter. The road had already claimed him, and now it was showing him its true face. He felt his legs buckle beneath him, as if the ground had turned to quicksand, dragging him deeper into its grasp. "No," he gasped, his voice trembling as the figure stepped closer, its laughter filling the air. The sound was sharp and unholy, like the cracking of bones in a silent room. "Please, I just want to leave. I just want to find the way back." The figure's lips twisted into a grotesque smile. "There is no way back," it whispered, its voice now echoing, as though the entire road was speaking through it. "You're here now, just like the rest of us." Paul's mind reeled. His body fought against the inevitable, but the road, the fog, the darkness, they were all closing in on him, suffocating him. He tried to move, tried to push forward, but every step felt like he was being dragged backward. It was as if the road was alive, pulling him into the depths of its endless maw. The air grew colder, the fog thicker, until Paul couldn't even see his own hand in front of his face. He could hear the voices, too, soft whispers, indistinguishable at first, but growing louder with every passing second. The lost souls, the damned. Their voices filled his head, each one a cry for help, each one a desperate plea to escape the road's grasp. "Help us," a voice moaned, so close it seemed to be right behind him. "Help us before it's too late. Please don't leave us," another voice pleaded, broken and full of terror. The whispers came from everywhere, surrounding him, closing in. Paul's heart pounded in his chest as he stumbled forward, his feet tripping over the uneven ground. His head spun. His legs felt like lead. But the voices, they kept calling, each one more desperate than the last, like an overwhelming tide that pulled at his sanity, dragging him deeper into madness. He had to get away. He had to. "What are you?" Paul cried out, his voice cracking with fear. "Who are you?" The figure that had been tormenting him appeared again, its form now more tangible, more solid, like it had taken shape from the very fog itself. Its eyes, those cold, empty sockets, stared into Paul's soul. "We are the road," it whispered. "We are the ones who failed, the ones who couldn't leave, the ones who tried to escape but only became a part of it. And now so are you. Paul shook his head, his vision blurred with tears. No, no, this isn't real. The figure tilted its head slightly, as if studying him with a strange curiosity. It's real for you now. You're here, and you'll stay here, forever, like all the rest of us. The fog thickened again, pressing in like a crushing weight. The road twisted and writhed beneath his feet, pulling him further into its embrace. He stumbled forward, his hands reaching out desperately for something, anything, to break the endless cycle of despair. But there was nothing. The voices grew louder, more frantic, their cries blending into a single, deafening roar. They surrounded him, suffocating him, tearing at his mind with their need, their desperation. Please don't leave us here, a voice begged just behind him. Paul turned, his heart racing, but when he looked, there was nothing there. Only the empty, suffocating fog and the twisted road stretching endlessly before him. Help us, the voices cried. We can't escape. Help us, please. He fell to his knees, overwhelmed, his mind spinning with the weight of it all. The endless road, the endless suffering. He was part of it now, wasn't he? He had crossed a point of no return. His soul, his very being, was already claimed. He could feel the weight of it pressing down on him, sinking into his chest like a stone. The road decides. The road always decides. The figure's voice echoed in his mind, and Paul's chest tightened as the truth settled in. He had never stood a chance. None of them had. No, he whispered, tears streaming down his face. I can't be one of you. But even as he spoke, he felt it, the change, slow but inevitable. His body felt heavier, his movements slower. His limbs began to stiffen, as though the road was pulling him further into its grasp, melding his flesh to its eternal, unyielding path. The fog seemed to swirl around him, wrapping him in its icy fingers. The voices grew silent for a moment, and then just as quickly they returned, louder than before, crashing over him like a tidal wave of despair. You'll be one of us soon, the voices whispered. We will walk together. We will never leave. Never again. The figure appeared once more, standing before him, its hollow eyes watching him with a strange, unsettling calm. There was no pity in its gaze, no empathy, just the cold, unfeeling void of the road. You understand now, the figure said softly. You're not the first to come here, and you won't be the last. Paul could no longer fight it. His body, his mind, his very soul, all of it was being consumed by the road. The fog thickened again, and the world around him grew darker, more twisted, until there was nothing but the road and the lost souls wandering its endless path. He was one of them now. He had always been one of them, and the road would never let him go. Paul's body felt heavy like lead, and his limbs were stiff, almost as if they were no longer his own. The road beneath his feet vibrated with an eerie hum, the kind of hum that thrummed in his chest like the pulse of something ancient and alive. His breath came in short, ragged gasps, but the air felt thick, like the fog itself was trying to suffocate him. He tried to move, to take a step, but the road fought back. It held him in place, as if the very ground was claiming him. His legs refused to obey, frozen in place, his mind screaming for him to run, but his body refused to cooperate. No, please, Paul begged, his voice breaking. Please let me go. Let me go back to the road I knew, to the world that made sense. But there was no answer, only the hum of the road, and the soft shuffle of footsteps in the distance. Those lost souls, they were everywhere now, so many of them, wandering aimlessly, their eyes hollow, their faces twisted in sorrow and despair. Their lanterns flickered in the fog like dying stars, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch for miles. Some of them had stopped to look at Paul, their gazes empty, their mouths moving, whispering words that Paul couldn't understand. Some of them were crying, their silent sobs barely audible over the constant murmur of the road. Others simply walked, mindlessly, as though they had forgotten the world that existed before they were claimed by this place. And then there was the figure. the one who had spoken to him earlier, the one who had shown him the truth. It stood in the distance, watching him with those same cold, empty eyes, its lantern casting an unsettling light on the road. Its presence seemed to pull at Paul's very soul, as though it was calling to him, drawing him closer to the darkness. The figure's mouth opened slowly, and its voice was soft, almost a whisper, but it was louder than the hum of the road. "You're not the first," it said, "and you won't be the last." Paul felt the cold grip of despair tightening around his chest. He had tried to resist. He had fought. But now, in the face of the figure and the truth it spoke, all of his resistance seemed meaningless. The road had already claimed him. There was no escape. I don't belong here," Paul whispered, his voice trembling. "I don't belong with them." The figure tilted its head, as if considering his words. "You don't get to decide," it said softly. "None of us do. Once you're here, you belong. You belong to the road." Paul's eyes darted around him, looking for anything, any sign of hope, of a way out. But the road stretched endlessly in all directions. The fog was so thick now that it swallowed everything around him, the land disappearing into nothingness, as if the road was a portal to somewhere beyond the world he had known. He could feel the weight of the past pressing down on him. The memories of his life, his family, the world he once took for granted, seemed so far away now, like a fading dream. How had it all gone so wrong? How had a simple road trip turned into this nightmare? His thoughts were interrupted by a low, rasping voice. It was the woman's voice again. "Paul!" The voice came from behind him, soft and fragile, like the wind whispering through the trees. It sounded so familiar, so real. It was Marie. He knew it. His heart skipped a beat, and he spun around, hoping, praying, that she was there. But when he turned, there was no one. Only the empty road. Only the endless fog. "Marie," he breathed, but there was no answer. The figure stepped closer, its hollow eyes fixed on Paul. It didn't speak, but its presence was enough. It didn't need words. Its gaze alone was like a suffocating force, pulling him deeper into the fog, deeper into the road's grip. "You're still trying to escape," the figure said softly. "Still hoping for a way out." Paul clenched his fists, his nails digging into his palms as the frustration and despair surged through him. He didn't want this. He didn't want to accept it, but it was becoming harder to deny. His legs trembled beneath him, and for a brief moment, he thought he might collapse right there on the road. And then, just as quickly, the fog seemed to shift again, swirling around him like a living thing. The ground beneath his feet began to rumble, a deep, pulsing vibration that rattled his bones. The road groaned, as if alive, as if it was waking up, stretching its limbs after an eternity of slumber. From the distance, a new sound began to rise, a low, eerie chant. It was distant at first, like the murmuring of 1,000 voices. But as the road shook and the fog churned, the chant grew louder, more insistent. It was a song, but it wasn't a song of joy. It was a song of death, a song of hopelessness, a song of those who had been claimed by the road long before Paul ever set foot on it. And then he saw them. Figures emerged from the fog, marching slowly, their faces hidden in the shadows, their bodies shrouded in tattered cloaks. They moved in perfect unison, like an army of the dead, their feet shuffling in time with the eerie chant. They carried lanterns, their light casting long, flickering shadows on the road as they walked toward Paul. He froze, his heart pounding in his chest as the figures drew nearer. There was something deeply wrong about them. Their movements were mechanical, almost like puppets being pulled by invisible strings. Their eyes, when he could catch a glimpse, were hollow and empty, like the eyes of the damned. The chant grew louder, closer. Their lanterns flickered and danced, casting warped shadows that twisted and writhed like serpents. Paul turned his head, but there was no escape. The road stretched endlessly before him, and behind him, the figures kept coming. The fog closed in around him, thick and oppressive. The ground beneath his feet trembled, and he could feel the road pulling at him again, dragging him toward the procession of the lost. And just when he thought he might break, just when he thought he might finally give in to the overwhelming terror and despair, something strange happened. A voice, a familiar voice, cut through the chant. "Paul!" It was Marie's voice. He looked around desperately, his eyes wide with panic. The fog parted just enough for him to see her, her form, her face, standing just beyond the procession of figures. She was real. She had to be. "Marie!" he cried out, his voice hoarse and desperate. "I'm here. I'm coming. Please help me." But as he took a step toward her, the figures moved faster. Their chant grew louder, more frantic. And then, in an instant, the fog closed in again, swallowing her, swallowing everything, leaving only the endless road and the eternal darkness that had claimed it. Paul stumbled back, his heart racing, his breaths coming in ragged gasps. He tried to push through the fog, to break free of the endless procession of figures and the chanting that seemed to come from all directions at once. But every time he moved forward, the road pulled him back, dragging him into its grip. The figures, their hollow eyes watching him from the shadows, circled closer. Their chant rose to a deafening volume, the sound filling his mind, drowning out everything else. His thoughts felt fragmented, pieces of his past slipping through his fingers like sand, lost to the fog. He couldn't escape. He knew it now. He couldn't fight it. "Please," Paul whispered, his voice breaking. "Please let me go. Let me leave. I don't belong here. I just want to see her again. I just want to be free." But the figures did not answer. They did not stop. Their cold, unfeeling eyes never left him as they continued their slow march. The chanting grew louder still, until it felt like it was inside his skull, vibrating his bones, rattling his thoughts. And then, from somewhere in the distance, a new sound joined the chant, a low, guttural sound, like the growl of a beast, echoing from the depths of the road itself. Paul turned, his eyes wide with terror, but there was nothing. Just the endless fog, the eternal road, and the sound of the growl growing louder, closer. He couldn't see it, but he could feel it. Something was coming. Something vast, something ancient, and it was getting closer with every passing second. The ground beneath his feet shook harder now, the vibrations running through his entire body. His knees buckled, and he fell to the ground, his palms scraping against the rough road. The chant was so loud now, so overwhelming, that his ears rang with it, the words twisted and distorted, almost unintelligible, but still, they filled his mind with a sense of dread he couldn't escape. "You're one of us now," a voice whispered in his ear, so close he could feel its breath on his neck. "You'll never leave." The growl rose in volume again, louder than ever before, and then, with a sudden rush, the fog parted just slightly, revealing a shadow, a massive, hulking figure, barely visible through the mist. Its outline was grotesque, towering over everything else, a mass of shifting darkness that seemed to move with purpose, as if it were the road itself taking shape, emerging from the depths of the earth. Paul's heart skipped a beat. The creature's eyes glowed, faintly at first, then brighter, burning like coals in a fire. It was coming for him, and there was nowhere to run. His mind was a blur, his body frozen in place. He couldn't even scream. All he could do was watch as the creature closed the distance between them, its massive form looming over him, casting an impenetrable shadow. And then, before he could react, the creature stopped. Its head tilted slightly to one side, as if studying him, and for a moment, everything went quiet. The chant, the growl, the fog, it all seemed to pause, holding its breath as if waiting for something. Paul tried to speak, to beg for mercy, but no words came. His throat was tight, his voice strangled by the oppressive weight of the air around him. The creature's gaze was piercing, its glowing eyes burning into his very soul. And then, just when Paul thought he might lose himself to the madness, the creature spoke. "You're not the first," it growled, its voice deep and resonant, like the earth itself had opened its mouth. "And you won't be the last. You're just another soul claimed by the road. Paul's legs trembled, and he felt himself sinking, the weight of its words pressing down on him. He had never felt so small, so insignificant. He had thought the road was just a path to get from one place to another, but now he understood. The road was a place that consumed, that took, that never let go. "Please," Paul whispered, his voice barely audible, choked with fear. "I don't want this. I don't want to be like them." The creature's eyes seemed to soften, just for a moment, before it growled again, its voice more threatening this time. "You're not special. None of you are. You all come here for the same reason. A choice, a chance, a detour. And in the end, you all find the same fate." It stepped forward, its massive footfalls shaking the ground beneath Paul's body. The air was thick with the stench of decay, of something ancient and forgotten. Paul's chest tightened, his breath coming in shallow gasps as he struggled to comprehend what was happening, to hold on to any thread of rational thought. You can't be real," he choked out, his hands shaking as he tried to push himself up. This can't be happening." The creature's laugh rumbled through the air, low and menacing. "Oh, it's real," it said, its voice full of mockery. "And it's happening, whether you want it or not." And with that, the creature stepped closer, its massive shadow swallowing him whole, and Paul felt himself being pulled into the darkness, the weight of the road bearing down on him, dragging him deeper into its eternal grasp. He fought, he screamed, he begged, but the road was relentless. It took everything from him, the air, the light, the very sound of his own voice. It was a force beyond understanding, beyond resistance. And then, with one final, desperate cry, Paul was consumed. The road had taken him, just as it had taken so many others before him. Paul's senses faded, his consciousness dimming, and for a moment, he thought he might slip into a dreamless sleep. But no, the road wasn't done with him yet. The darkness closed in around him, but he wasn't alone. He could feel it, the presence of the others, the lost souls who had walked this cursed path before him, their voices calling to him from the depths of the fog. They whispered his name, their voices muffled and distant, like they were trapped in another world just out of reach. But their whispers carried weight, heavy with years, centuries even of torment. They weren't just voices. They were the echo of a nightmare that never ended, an endless chorus of the damned. And now Paul was one of them. "Paul," came the soft, familiar voice again, and his heart skipped, a brief spark of hope. "Murray?" His eyes snapped open, but there was nothing to see. The fog swallowed him whole. There was only the damp, cold air pressing against his skin, the scent of decay in the air, the weight of 1,000 lost souls hanging over him. The road beneath him felt endless, stretching far beyond what his eyes could see, bending and twisting in ways that defied logic. It was a maze, a place with no clear beginning and no end, just the continuous, suffocating pulse of the road, pulling him deeper. "Marie," he whispered, as though hoping that speaking her name would bring her back to him, that somehow she would reach him through this nightmare. But the road didn't listen. The fog didn't care. Instead, the chanting started again, low, mournful, distant. The rhythm of it made Paul's head spin, a steady hum that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. It was the song of the road, the song of those who had been claimed before him, and it was never-ending. The fog parted, just enough for Paul to see the figures. More of them. They shuffled forward, their faces blurred and indistinct, their movements jerky and unnatural. They were like the others, lost, broken, hopeless. They walked in a procession, as if they were marching towards something, or perhaps away from it. There was no way to know. But there was one thing Paul knew for certain: they weren't going anywhere. They were trapped, and now he was too. He tried to move, but the road held him in place. It was like invisible hands gripping his legs, holding him back. His body screamed for freedom, but his mind was too far gone, lost in the endless cycle of hopelessness that surrounded him. And then, from the fog, a figure emerged. Tall, cloaked in a dark, tattered robe, its face hidden in shadow. Its lantern flickered, casting an eerie glow on the ground at its feet. Paul felt the coldness of its presence before it spoke. "You found it, haven't you?" the figure asked, its voice like a rasp, deep and hollow. The words seemed to vibrate in the air, hanging like smoke in the damp night. I don't understand," Paul stammered, his voice trembling. "Why am I here? What is this place?" The figure tilted its head, its movements slow and deliberate. The lantern swayed in its hand, casting a long, flickering shadow on the road. "This is the Forgotten Highway," it said, its voice like the wind rustling through dry leaves. "A place between places. A road that leads nowhere and everywhere. A road that consumes all who wander off the path. It doesn't matter how you got here, only that you did. And now, like the rest, you belong to it." Paul felt the cold sting of its words sink deep into his chest. He was trapped. He had always been trapped. The road, the fog, the figures, it was all part of the same unending nightmare. There was no escape. "I don't want this," Paul whispered, his hands trembling at his sides. "I want to go home." The figure didn't respond immediately. It simply stood there, watching him with eyes that held centuries of pain and loss. When it spoke again, its words were soft, almost gentle, but they struck Paul like a hammer. "You are home," it said. "This road is your home now. There is no going back. The way out is lost, and the path that brought you here has disappeared. What remains is the road, and the road remains forever." The weight of its words hit Paul all at once, suffocating him. The fog, the figures, the endless march, they weren't just part of the road, they were the road. And the road was all that was left. "No, no," Paul muttered, shaking his head, backing away, his heart pounding in his chest. "There must be a way. There has to be a way out." But the figure only watched him, its eyes unblinking, as if it had seen this desperation 1,000 times before. "There is no way out," the figure repeated. "Not for you. Not for anyone who comes this way. Once you've crossed the threshold, you belong to the road, just like all the others." The world around Paul seemed to darken, the fog thickening as the figure's words settled over him like a heavy blanket. The chanting, once distant, was now right in his ears. The hum of the road, the footsteps of the lost, the whispers of the forgotten, it was all around him, and he couldn't escape it. Desperation clawed at him, and he took a few steps back, his eyes scanning the fog, searching for any hint of a way out. But there was nothing, only the endless road. "What happens to us?" Paul asked, his voice trembling with fear. The figure's face remained hidden in shadow, but Paul could sense its smile, a slow, knowing curl of something cruel. "You walk," it said simply. "You walk forever like the rest. The road never ends. The fog never lifts. And you'll never find peace, because the road will never let you go. It claims you, and when it's done with you, it will claim someone else." Paul's body grew heavy. The weight of the figure's words sank into him, and he realized, with a sickening clarity, that he was no different from the others. No different from the lost souls who wandered endlessly, searching for an escape that didn't exist. The fog thickened again, and the figure turned, its footsteps vanishing into the mist. The chant grew louder, and the road began to shift beneath Paul's feet, like the ground was moving, swallowing the landscape. The figures continued their endless march, and the soft whisper of the lost echoed in his ears. And Paul, too, began to walk. Paul's steps were slow at first, his feet dragging across the cold, uneven road, but something inside him urged him to keep moving. There was no sense in resisting anymore. He had no power here, no will to fight the inevitable. Every step he took was another surrender, another moment swallowed by the darkness. He glanced over his shoulder once, hoping for a glimpse of something familiar, anything to reassure him that he wasn't truly lost. But all he saw was the same endless fog, the same barren landscape stretching out into nothingness. The figures continued their march beside him, their faces blurred and indistinct, their movements synchronized with his own, as if they were walking in the same grim procession. As the minutes, or perhaps hours, passed, Paul's thoughts began to blur too. Time had no meaning here. There was only the road, the never-ending road, its surface rough and uneven, as though it had been worn down by centuries of use. The cold air wrapped itself around him like a suffocating shroud, and the sound of the chanting, the voices that filled his mind, was constant, unyielding. They murmured in a language he couldn't understand, words twisted by the fog, but their meaning was clear enough. They were calling to him, guiding him forward, pulling him deeper into the nightmare. His throat was dry, his mouth parched, but he didn't stop. He couldn't stop. There was no end to the road, no place to rest, no place to hide. He had to keep moving, because if he stopped, if he even dared to look away, he knew the road would consume him completely. Every so often he would hear the growl, the deep, guttural sound that seemed to come from the very depths of the road itself, echoing through the air like some ancient beast stirred from its slumber. But every time the growl rumbled through the mist, it felt closer, its presence suffocating. Paul's heart would race, his breath catching in his throat, but he never dared to turn around, to look into the shadows where the creature might be waiting. The road stretched on, a never-ending ribbon of darkness, and Paul began to wonder if he had already passed the point of no return. Was there any hope left? Could he even remember what hope felt like? His thoughts were scattered, as if the very act of walking was draining him of everything that made him human. Then, without warning, the fog seemed to part, just enough for Paul to see something new ahead of him, a structure rising from the mist. It was tall, twisted, and ancient, its shape barely discernible through the thick veil of fog. But Paul knew what it was. He could feel it. The road had brought him here. The figure in the tattered cloak had warned him that the road led to nowhere, but now he saw that wasn't entirely true. It had a destination, after all. The road led to this place, this thing, whatever it was. The building loomed ahead, its walls blackened by time, its windows shattered, like eyes that had long since lost their sight. It was as though it had been standing there for centuries, a monument to forgotten things, a place where the road itself ended. Or perhaps it was a beginning. Paul couldn't be sure anymore. He took a step toward it, drawn in by some invisible force, his legs moving of their own accord, and the figures around him mirrored his every movement. They too walked toward the building, their feet shuffling in unison, their eyes fixed ahead. As he approached, the air grew colder still, a coldness that sank into his bones, chilling him from the inside out. The growl, that low, menacing sound, grew louder, more distinct. It was coming from inside the building. Something was waiting for him there. He reached the door, a massive wooden thing, carved with strange symbols that seemed to twist and writhe beneath his gaze. There were no handles, no visible way to open it, but when Paul reached out, the door creaked open, as if welcoming him inside. He stepped through, his heart pounding in his chest, and the fog swallowed him once again. The inside of the building was just as bleak as the road itself. It was a vast, empty hall, its walls lined with ancient stone, the floor covered in a thick layer of dust. The air was heavy with the scent of decay, the remnants of something long past, something lost to time. The only light came from a single flickering torch on the far wall, casting eerie shadows that danced across the floor. The chanting had stopped. The figures had stopped. There was only silence now. But it wasn't the comforting silence of solitude. It was the silence of a place that was waiting, that was listening. Paul's breath echoed in the emptiness as he walked deeper into the building, the sound of his footsteps muffled by the dust. He felt a strange pull toward the far end of the hall, toward a darkened doorway that seemed to beckon him. It was as though something inside the room was calling to him, urging him forward. He reached the door, his hand trembling as he pushed it open, and stepped into a room that was unlike anything he had seen before. The walls were covered in strange symbols, symbols that seemed to shift and change when he wasn't looking directly at them. The floor was cracked, and in the center of the room stood a massive stone altar, worn by centuries of use, covered in what looked like old bloodstains. At the far end of the room, a figure stood. It was a woman, her face obscured by a veil of dark hair, her body draped in a tattered cloak. She was motionless, staring at the altar with an intensity that made Paul's skin crawl. And when she turned her head slowly to face him, her eyes were not eyes at all. They were black pits, empty and void of any emotion, but they still saw him, saw through him, as though she were staring directly into his soul. "You've come," she said, her voice soft, barely above a whisper, yet it rang out in the silence like a bell. "You've come to finish what you started." Paul didn't understand. He wanted to ask, to beg for answers, but the words stuck in his throat. The room felt suffocating, the air thick with an oppressive weight. "The road has claimed you," she continued, her voice growing colder. "And now, you must take your place among us." Paul took a step back, his heart hammering in his chest. The road had taken him here, but what was this place? Who is this woman? "You're not the first to seek escape," she said, as though reading his thoughts. "But you won't be the last. You'll become like them, just another lost soul, walking the road with no end. You'll walk forever, Paul, just like the others." The growl, the one he had been hearing in the distance, rumbled through the room now, low and deep, a sound that made the very walls tremble. The woman's eyes glinted with something dark, something ancient. "And when you're ready," she whispered, stepping closer, her voice now like a hiss, "the road will take you home." Paul's head spun. The weight of her words crashed over him like a wave, threatening to drown him in their meaning. "Take your place among us." Her words were clear, but their meaning remained elusive. What did it mean? Was he doomed to wander this road for eternity, like the others who had been lost before him? Was this truly his fate now, to become part of the endless procession of the forgotten? His legs were weak beneath him, his body trembling with fear and disbelief. He wanted to run. He wanted to scream, to break free of the suffocating pull of the road, but something deeper inside him, the same force that had brought him here, held him in place. It was as though the room itself was alive, its walls closing in, pushing him further into the web of torment that had already ensnared him. The woman took another step toward him, her feet gliding silently across the dust-covered floor. The growl, the same low, menacing rumble, continued to vibrate through the room. It was coming closer, he could feel it. Something was approaching, something ancient, something hungry. "You've felt it, haven't you?" the woman whispered, her voice as cold as the stone altar behind her. "The road is alive. It calls to you. It claims you. And it doesn't let go." Paul couldn't speak. He couldn't even think. The words, the growl, the whispers, they all bled together into a suffocating noise, drowning out everything else. The room seemed to stretch and shift, the symbols on the walls swirling, bending, becoming more distorted with every passing moment. He had to escape. He had to get out of here. Without thinking, Paul turned, his body moving on instinct, and bolted for the door. But as he reached it, the room shifted again. The doorway was gone. In its place, there was only more wall, smooth, cold stone, with no sign of the exit. The space before him was now just a labyrinth, endless and twisted, and the woman's laughter echoed in his ears. "You can't leave," she said, her voice now full of dark amusement. "None of you can." He slammed his hands against the stone, desperately searching for any crack, any gap, any sign of an escape. But it was futile. The room pressed in on him from all sides. The growl, now deafening, rumbled beneath the floor, like the heartbeat of some monstrous creature stirring in the depths of the building. And then, from the shadows, something emerged. At first, it was just a silhouette, too dark to make out clearly, but as it drew closer, Paul's heart stopped. It was a creature, its body tall and gaunt, with twisted limbs that seemed to bend in impossible angles. Its face was a grotesque mask of twisted flesh, its eyes glowing with a sickly yellow light. Its mouth was wide, too wide, stretching across its face in a grim, horrifying grin. And its teeth, they were long, sharp, like the fangs of a predator. It was the thing from the road, the creature he had heard growling in the distance. It had been following him, waiting for him, just as it had done for all those before him. The woman didn't speak again. She simply watched as the creature drew closer, its eyes fixed on Paul, its mouth opening wider as if it were savoring the moment. The growl intensified, and Paul could feel his heart thundering in his chest, the panic rising in his throat. This was it. This was the end. He turned, his eyes wild, and ran deeper into the labyrinth, away from the creature, away from the woman, away from everything. His feet pounded against the cold stone, his breath coming in ragged gasps as he twisted and turned, desperately trying to find a way out. But there was no way out. The walls seemed to shift, rearranging themselves as though the building itself was alive, twisting and contorting to trap him further. Every corner he rounded led to another dead end, and behind him he could hear the creature's footsteps, slow but relentless. It was gaining on him. The woman's laughter echoed through the halls, growing louder and louder until it felt like it was coming from every direction. There was no escape from her, no escape from the road. Paul's legs were burning, his body screaming for him to stop, but he couldn't. He had to keep moving. There had to be a way out. And then, just as he thought he couldn't go any further, he stumbled into another room, a smaller, dimly lit space. In the center stood a mirror, framed in dark wood, the glass reflecting nothing but darkness. No image of Paul, no reflection, just blackness. His breath caught in his throat. He didn't want to look into it. He knew what it would show, his own face, twisted and contorted by the road, the same as the others who had walked this path before him. He knew what the mirror would reveal, a lost soul trapped forever. But something in him forced him to step closer. It was like the road itself was urging him forward, forcing him to confront the truth. He had no choice but to look. As he stepped toward the mirror, the darkness within it seemed to shift. It was no longer just an empty reflection. Something was moving inside the glass, something dark and formless, like a shadow, but it was more than that. It was the road, the fog, the growl, and then his own reflection appeared. But it wasn't him. It was the man he would become, someone hollow, someone lost. His eyes were black, his face gaunt and worn with the weight of years spent walking the road. He was no longer human. He was a part of it. He reached out, his hand trembling, and touched the glass. The moment his fingers made contact, the reflection shifted again, and Paul's heart froze. The mirror wasn't just showing him the man he would become. It was showing him the man he had already become. He was already one of them. The growl, now deafening, rumbled from the depths of the building. The creature's steps were closing in, faster now. Paul spun around, but the room too was changing. The walls began to pulse, the floor buckling beneath him as the road beneath the building began to twist and turn, like it was alive. The dark, twisted figure of the creature loomed at the door, its grin wide and sharp, its teeth gleaming in the dim light. "You're one of us now," the woman's voice came from the shadows, soft and final. And Paul knew it was true. There was no way back. There was no escape from the road. There was only the endless walk and the fog and the growl. And so he walked. The walls of the room closed in around Paul, the air thick and oppressive, as though the building itself was breathing. The growl reverberated through the stone, and the floor trembled beneath his feet. He didn't know how much time had passed since he had first entered the structure, but it didn't matter. Time had no meaning here. His body felt numb, the exhaustion settling deep in his bones. The road had already claimed so much of him, his will, his hope, his sanity. And yet, there was a nagging thought still clinging to the back of his mind. Why me? Why was I chosen for this fate? As the creature moved closer, its form shifting and bending, Paul could feel the air growing heavier. It was as though the very atmosphere had become charged, filled with a dark energy that gnawed at him, weakening his resolve. The woman's voice echoed in his head, her words like poison dripping into his thoughts, suffocating him from within. "You're not the first," she had said. And you won't be the last. The thought of the countless others who had walked this road before him, their souls now lost to the fog, made him shudder. Had they ever known what they were walking into? Or had they too been lured by the same sense of hope, the same desperation that had pulled him in? He glanced back at the mirror one last time. His reflection was still there, staring back at him with hollow eyes. It wasn't just a reflection, it was the truth. The man he was seeing wasn't Paul anymore. It was a twisted version of him, a shadow that had long since lost its humanity. He was already one of them. The growl grew louder, and the creature, its limbs contorted and unnatural, reached out a clawed hand. Its fingers were long, jagged, like the roots of some ancient tree, and they scraped against the stone floor as it closed the distance between them. Paul felt an overwhelming sense of dread clawing at his chest. His body screamed at him to run, to fight, to do anything, but there was nowhere to go. The walls had closed in too tightly. There was no escape. And then the creature spoke, its voice low and guttural, like the grinding of rocks against each other. "You are home now," it said, its voice vibrating through the air. "This is where the road ends, and where you begin." Paul's knees buckled, his mind spinning. He wanted to scream, to tear himself away from this nightmare, but the words wouldn't come. His mouth was dry, and his body felt as though it were made of stone. He couldn't move. He couldn't think. The creature's presence was overwhelming, suffocating, and Paul could feel the darkness closing in on him, consuming him from the inside out. The woman's voice echoed again, cold and distant, as if she were speaking from some far-off place. "You'll walk this road forever now, Paul," she said, her words dripping with finality. "You will never leave. You will never wake up. You will never be free." And in that moment, Paul understood. The road wasn't just a physical place. It was a prison, a trap that bound the souls of those who wandered onto it. It didn't just steal their bodies, it stole their very essence, their very will to escape. The figures that had walked beside him for so long, those lost souls, weren't just mindless. They were aware, just as he was. But they had long since given up, their will completely shattered by the endless march. They had no choice but to keep walking, to keep going, until they became part of the road itself. Paul didn't know how much longer he could keep his sanity intact. Every passing second felt like an eternity. The growl, the voices, the endless fog, they were all part of the same nightmare, one that he had now become trapped in. With a final, desperate cry, Paul stumbled backward, his hands bracing against the cold stone walls. But even as he tried to push himself away, he could feel the road pulling him back, tightening its grip on him like an iron vice. The creature loomed over him, its eyes glowing with a hunger that couldn't be quenched. It bared its teeth in a smile that was both grotesque and terrifying. "This is your fate now," it hissed, its voice dripping with malice. "There is no end to this road. Only the endless walk, the endless wait. You will become like us, lost, forgotten, and forever wandering." Paul tried to move, to resist, but his body was no longer his own. The weight of the road had drained him, hollowed him out, until there was nothing left but the faintest whisper of the man he had once been. And then he felt it, the pull of the road, the binding force that drew him forward, step by step. He wasn't walking anymore. The road was carrying him. It was taking him, dragging him down, and he couldn't fight it. The fog thickened around him, suffocating him in its embrace. He could hear the soft murmurs of the lost souls, their voices blending with his own, until they became one. He was no longer alone. He was part of the road, part of the endless journey that never ended. As he took the first step, his body moving with the others, he felt a final shift inside him. His identity, his memories, everything that made him, faded away, swallowed by the darkness. And then there was only the road. The road stretched out endlessly before Paul, its twists and turns becoming indistinguishable from one another. The landscape around him had long since lost any sense of reality. What was once the familiar, mundane world had transformed into a place of unrelenting dread. a place where time no longer had meaning, and the past seemed to exist only as a fleeting memory, a wisp of smoke that disappeared the moment he tried to grasp it. The fog was thick, wrapping around him like an unseen hand. It pressed against his skin, making it hard to breathe. But it wasn't just the fog that felt suffocating. It was the weight of everything, the weight of the road, of the souls that had walked it before him, of the creature that stalked the shadows. He could feel their eyes on him, their hollow, empty gazes, watching him as he stumbled along. His legs moved on their own, his feet dragging through the dust, as though the road itself was guiding him, pulling him forward. He could hear the faint echoes of other footsteps, distant and indistinct, like the whispers of those who had already lost their way. And then as he walked, he saw it. A flicker of light through the fog, a distant glow that pierced the endless gray. It was a lantern, its flickering flame weak and struggling, as though it too was being consumed by the fog. Paul's heart leapt at the sight. Maybe this was it. Maybe this was the way out. He had to reach it. He had to. A sudden, sharp pain shot through his chest, a pressure so intense that it forced him to stop. His hand went to his chest, and he could feel his heartbeat, fast, erratic, like it was trying to escape his body. His breath came in ragged gasps, and for a moment, he thought he might collapse. But then, as quickly as it came, the pain vanished. He stood still for a moment, bewildered, trying to understand what had just happened. Had it been real? Or had the road, in its twisted design, simply tried to break him further? He shook his head and tried to focus. The lantern, it was still there, burning weakly through the fog. This is my chance, he thought, desperate to believe it. If I can get to that lantern, maybe I can find a way out. Maybe this nightmare can end. Paul stumbled forward, his legs heavy and uncooperative, but he kept moving. He was drawn to the light, as though it held the answer to everything. Every step was a battle, his body fighting against the force of the road, but he didn't stop. He couldn't stop. The lantern grew closer with each step, its flame growing brighter, until it seemed like the only thing in the world that mattered. He could almost hear the soft, melodic hum of the flame, as though it were calling to him, guiding him, offering him hope. But then, just as he reached out to touch it, the lantern flickered once more, and the light went out. Everything went dark. The air became colder, and the fog thickened around him until he could see nothing. Not even his own hands in front of his face. The darkness was absolute, pressing in on him from every side, suffocating him. He felt his chest tighten, and his heart began to race again, the panic creeping up on him like a shadow. Where am I? He whispered into the darkness, his voice trembling. No answer came. The silence was deafening. And then a voice broke the stillness, a soft, almost musical voice coming from somewhere deep within the fog. It was familiar, but Paul couldn't place it. You should have known, it said, its tone almost gentle, yet filled with a sorrow that made Paul's skin crawl. He turned in the direction of the voice, his eyes straining in the dark, trying to see through the dense fog. You are one of us now, the voice continued, its whisper just on the edge of hearing. There's no going back. There never was. Paul's mind raced. The voice, it was his voice. The words were the same words he had heard in the depths of the labyrinth, in the room with the mirror. You are one of us now. It wasn't just a warning. It was the truth. He tried to scream, to call out, but the words wouldn't come. The fog thickened, and the growl that had followed him since the beginning, rose from the depths of the darkness, louder and more menacing than ever before. It was coming. It was closing in. Suddenly he felt it, them, the others, the lost souls that had walked the road before him. They were here, all around him, their presence heavy in the air. He could hear them, faint whispers, like a chorus of voices rising and falling in the distance. They were speaking in a language he didn't understand, but their words were unmistakable. Welcome. Paul's breath quickened. No, I can't be one of them. Not yet. I can't. But his feet moved on their own, as though they were no longer his to command. The road was pulling him once more. It was as if he were already part of the endless procession, walking with the others who had long since lost their names, their identities, their hope. He stumbled forward again, his feet dragging, the fog swirling around him like a living thing. He couldn't see where he was going. He couldn't see anything at all. All that remained was the growl, the whispers, the weight of the road that pressed on him, pulling him, claiming him. And in the distance, he heard something else, a sound that froze him in his tracks. A door. It was faint at first, just a creak, a whisper of movement, but it grew louder, closer. The door was opening, and with it came the unmistakable feeling that this was it. This was where the road had been leading him all along. The door opened fully with a sound that reverberated through the fog. Beyond it, there was nothing but darkness. A space that seemed to stretch on forever, an empty void waiting for him. A cold wind blew through, and he felt it. The final shift. The last step. Paul stepped forward, and the door slammed shut behind him. The air inside the room beyond the door was thick, heavy, and suffocating. The sound of it seemed to press against Paul's ears, and for a moment, he wondered if he had been sealed inside a tomb. His feet slid on the damp floor, his steps tentative as if the ground itself was untrustworthy. The fog had followed him, lingering just beyond the doorway, like a shadow that refused to let him go. As he stood in the room, an overwhelming sense of desolation washed over him. There was nothing here, nothing but empty space and silence. No walls, no windows, no light, just the sense of an endless void stretching beyond his reach. The room was not just devoid of life, it was devoid of anything real. It was as though it existed in between the cracks of time and space, a place outside of the world. Paul reached out, running his fingers over the cold, smooth surface of the air, trying to grasp something, anything. But there was nothing, no substance, no reality, only the unyielding sensation that he was being watched. A voice broke the silence again, but this time, it was not the voice of the woman, nor his own. This was different. It was older, colder, an echo of something ancient, buried deep within the earth. "You have reached the end," it said, its tone flat, emotionless. "The road has given you its final gift." Paul's heart skipped a beat. He knew that voice. He had heard it before, somewhere in the fog, deep in the dark corners of his mind. It wasn't a voice he had ever wanted to hear again. "What is this place?" Paul's voice cracked as he spoke, his throat dry, but there was no reply. The temperature in the room dropped. A sharp chill ran through his body, and he shivered violently, trying to steady himself. The feeling of being drawn in, of being pulled deeper into the unknown, intensified. He couldn't help but move forward, though he had no idea what awaited him. As he took another step, a soft light flickered in the distance. It was small at first, like a distant star, but it grew stronger the closer he came. The light was cold and pale, not like the lanterns he had seen before. This light didn't promise warmth, it promised something far more unsettling. Paul couldn't stop himself. He found himself walking toward it, unable to turn away. His feet moved as if guided by some unseen force, the road pulling him even further into the void. The light grew brighter, and he could make out a shape, a figure standing in the center of it, just beyond the reach of the light. The figure was tall, draped in shadows, with a face he couldn't see. It was like staring into an endless abyss. The figure didn't move, didn't speak, but Paul could feel its presence deep inside his chest. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice trembling, but the figure did not answer. Instead, it raised a hand, pointing to something behind him. Paul hesitated, a cold dread crawling up his spine, but slowly he turned. What he saw sent a wave of nausea through him. Behind him, the road stretched on, stretching forever into the distance. It was the same road, the one he had walked for so long. But it wasn't just the road that lay behind him, it was the faces of the lost souls. They were there, standing along the sides of the road, staring at him with hollow eyes, their expressions empty but knowing. They had been waiting for him. You were always meant to be here, the voice echoed once again, as though it came from everywhere, reverberating off the walls of the void. This place is your home now. You are one of us. A scream rose in Paul's throat, but it got stuck there, lodged somewhere deep within his chest. He couldn't scream. He couldn't run. He couldn't escape. The road stretched out before him, endless and unyielding. The figures on the sides of the road began to move, their forms shifting, becoming more defined, more real. They were walking toward him, their footsteps silent on the dirt road. Some reached out with pale, skeletal hands, others with faces twisted in pain. All of them were staring at him, each one more desperate than the last. Paul stumbled back, his breath coming faster and faster, his heart pounding in his chest as he realized what was happening. This wasn't just the end of his journey. It was the beginning of something far worse. He wasn't walking the road anymore. He was the road. The figures closed in on him, surrounding him, and Paul felt his body begin to shift, his limbs growing heavier. It wasn't just the weight of the fog that pressed against him. It was the weight of the souls. They were absorbing him, consuming him, pulling him into their endless, unfeeling procession. He couldn't fight it anymore. The figure in the center of the light watched him, silent and unmoving. Its face was still hidden in shadow, but somehow Paul knew that it wasn't interested in him. It had already given up on him. It was waiting for the next soul, the next lost traveler. And as Paul felt himself becoming one with the road, as his body dissolved into the fog and the dirt, he understood. He had been a part of the road from the very beginning. The moment he had stepped onto it, he had sealed his fate. There was no way off this highway. There was no escape. And so Paul walked, his feet dragging along the endless path, his body no longer his own. The road would keep him, keep all of them, until they too were forgotten. The faces of the lost souls blurred together, their whispers echoing in his mind, urging him to keep going, to keep walking. Because once you stepped onto the forgotten highway, you never truly left. The road would call again, and the next traveler would come. And that's the end of tonight's stories. Keep listening to the sound of rain and fall into a deep, peaceful sleep. Sweet dreams.